Chapter 1. The Weight of Justice. Amelia Bones could have left the office hours ago. The ministry corridors had long since emptied of their usual bustle, leaving only the soft hum of magical maintenance charms and the distant echo of her own breathing. The grandfather clock in the corner of her office chimed 11:30, its brass pendulum catching the warm light from the oil lamp on her desk. She should have been home by now, should have been checking on Susan's summer revision schedule or settling into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea and the evening prophet. Instead, she sat surrounded by files that made her stomach clench with a queasy mixture of disbelief and growing fury. The Potter file lay open before her, its contents spread across the mahogany surface like evidence at a crime scene. 3 days had passed since young Harry Potter's disciplinary hearing. 3 days since she had watched the boy produce a corporeal Patronus with the kind of skill that spoke of desperate necessity rather than academic achievement. She had cleared him of all charges, of course. The evidence had been overwhelmingly in his favor, and even Fudge's bluster couldn't obscure the simple truth that the boy had saved his cousin's life. But something about the hearing had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter, working deeper with each passing hour. The boy's posture, perhaps, the way he had sat perfectly still, shoulders squared but somehow diminished, as though he expected the worst and had long ago stopped hoping for anything better. Or maybe it was the careful way he had answered questions, offering only the precise information requested and nothing more, like someone who had learned that volunteering additional details was a mistake. Amelia reached for her tea, now cold, and grimaced at the bitter taste. The boy who lived, the savior of the wizarding world. And yet, when she had asked about his summer, he had simply said it was fine, in a tone that suggested the word meant something entirely different to him than it did to most 15-year-old boys. She turned her attention back to the files, her trained eye scanning the official documents with the methodical precision that had made her one of the youngest witches ever appointed to head the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The Potter case file should have been thick, comprehensive, filled with the kind of detailed documentation that accompanied any child placed in protective custody. Instead, it was criminally thin. A single sheet of parchment documented Harry Potter's placement with his Muggle relatives on November 1st, 1981. The form bore Albus Dumbledore's signature in his distinctive emerald ink, along with the notation, "Temporary emergency placement pending review." Amelia's eyes narrowed. Emergency placement. The kind of arrangement that was supposed to last days, perhaps weeks, while proper investigations were conducted and permanent solutions arranged. That had been nearly 14 years ago. She flipped through the remaining documents, her frown deepening with each page. A birth certificate, a death certificate for James and Lily Potter, a brief notation about the destruction of the family home in Godric's Hollow, and that was all. No follow-up reports, no welfare assessments, no documentation of the review that should have followed the emergency placement. Most damning of all, there was no record of anyone from the magical world having contact with Harry Potter between November 1981 and his Hogwarts letter in 1991. 10 years of silence. 10 years during which the most famous child in the wizarding world had simply vanished into the Muggle world, as though he had never existed. Amelia leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet office. This wasn't an oversight. Oversights left paper trails, bureaucratic confusion, conflicting reports. This was deliberate. Someone had made sure Harry Potter remained invisible to the magical world, and that someone had the authority to enforce that silence. The sound of the Flu network activating in her private fireplace made her look up sharply. Green flames danced in the hearth, and a moment later, Susan's head appeared among them, her blonde hair slightly disheveled, and her expression worried. Aunt Amelia? You're still at work? It's nearly midnight? Amelia glanced at the clock, surprised to find that Susan was right. Time had slipped away from her, as she had delved deeper into the Potter files. I'm sorry, dear. I got caught up in a case. Are you all right? Susan's head bobbed in the flames. I'm fine, but I was expecting you home ages ago. I wanted to ask you about something. She paused, chewing her lower lip in the way she had done since she was small, whenever she was uncertain about something. It's about Harry Potter. Amelia's attention sharpened. What about him? Well, you were at his hearing, weren't you? The one where he was cleared for using magic? Susan's voice carried a note of something that might have been relief. Everyone at Hogwarts was talking about it before term ended. Some of the Slytherins were saying horrible things, that he should have been expelled, but most of us were glad he wasn't in trouble. Why were you glad? Amelia asked carefully. She had learned long ago that Susan often saw things that adults missed, possessed an intuitive understanding of people that served her well in the complex social dynamics of Hogwarts. Susan was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful in the dancing green light. Because he's always been, I don't know how to explain it, polite but careful. Like he expects people to be angry with him, even when he hasn't done anything wrong. And he never talks about his family, which is odd because most students complain about their parents constantly. She shifted in the flames, looking uncomfortable. Some of the older students say his relatives are awful to him, that they hate magic and blame him for it. Amelia felt something cold settle in her stomach. What kind of awful? I don't know exactly. Nobody does really, because Harry never says anything. But Neville Longbottom told me that Harry once mentioned he wasn't allowed to do magic during the summers, not even accidental magic, or he'd be locked in his room. Susan's voice dropped lower. And Hannah Abbott said she saw him at King's Cross last year, and his relatives wouldn't even look at him. They just stood as far away as possible while he got his trunk, like they were embarrassed to be seen with him. The cold in Amelia's stomach spread outward, a creeping frost that made her hands clench involuntarily. She thought of the boy in the courtroom 3 days ago, the careful way he had held himself, the precision of his answers, the way he had said "fine" when asked about his summer, as though the word was a shield against further questions. "Susan," she said quietly, "has anyone from the magical world ever checked on Harry during the summers? Teachers? Ministry officials? Anyone?" Susan shook her head. "Not that anyone knows about. Professor McGonagall once mentioned in Transfiguration that contact between Hogwarts and students during holidays was limited to emergency situations only." "Why, Aunt Amelia? Is something wrong?" Amelia looked down at the pathetically thin file spread across her desk, at the single signature that had condemned a child to 14 years of isolation and quite possibly abuse. "I'm not sure yet, dear, but I may need to find out." After Susan's head disappeared from the flames, Amelia sat in the sudden silence of her office and felt the weight of realization settling on her shoulders. She had spent her entire career believing in the fundamental principle that the magical world protected its children, that the systems she served would never allow harm to come to the innocent. The Potter file suggested otherwise. She stood and walked to the window that overlooked the darkened streets of London, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Somewhere out there, in a suburb called Little Whinging, the most famous child in the wizarding world was quite possibly enduring treatment that would constitute criminal negligence at best and active abuse at worst. And the man responsible for placing him there, the man whose signature appeared on every relevant document, was Albus Dumbledore. The implications made her head spin. Dumbledore, the defeater of Grindelwald, the most respected wizard of their time, the man whose word carried more weight than the minister's in most matters of magical law. If she was right about what the files suggested, if Harry Potter had indeed been abandoned to suffer at the hands of relatives who despised him, then Dumbledore had committed a betrayal so fundamental that it shook the very foundations of the world she had spent her life serving. Amelia returned to her desk and pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her quill, not from fear, but from a fury so pure it threatened to consume her professional restraint. If Harry Potter had been harmed, if he had suffered in silence while the magical world celebrated his heroism from a distance, then someone would be held accountable. She began to write, her elegant script flowing across the parchment with the kind of deliberate precision that had made her legendary among both prosecutors and defense attorneys. The first subpoena was addressed to Professor Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The second to Rubeus Hagrid, Keeper of Keys and Grounds. The third to Albus Dumbledore himself. By the time she finished, dawn was painting the windows of her office pale gold, and a stack of official subpoenas lay before her, each one sealed with the crimson wax and silver seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the first step in what might be the most important investigation of her career. Amelia Bones had built her reputation on the principle that justice was blind to power, politics, and prestige. Tomorrow, she would discover whether that principle could survive contact with the most powerful wizard alive. She gathered the files and locked them in her personal vault, the one that responded only to her magical signature and would resist even the most determined attempts at tampering. Whatever came next, there would be no burying this investigation, no convenient accidents that might make inconvenient questions disappear. The boy who lived or deserved better than abandonment and silence, and Amelia Bones intended to make sure he got it. Chapter 2. Papers and Truth. The parchment arrived at Hogwarts with all the ceremony of an executioner's blade, carried by a ministry owl whose official red leg band marked it as bearing documents that could not be ignored, delayed, or conveniently lost. Professor McGonagall had been in her office, reviewing the class schedules for the upcoming term, when the tawny bird rapped sharply against her window, its yellow eyes fixed on her with the kind of patience that spoke of official business. She opened the window with hands that already knew, somehow, that whatever message this bird carried would change everything. The parchment was thick, formal, sealed with the crimson wax and silver seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Her name was written across the front in the precise script of someone who understood the weight of official documents. Minerva McGonagall broke the seal with deliberate care and read the contents twice before the full implications settled into her mind like stones dropping into still water. A subpoena. She was being summoned to testify before the Department of Magical Law Enforcement regarding matters pertaining to the placement and welfare of Harry James Potter during the period of November 1981 to present. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the parchment on her desk. 34 years of teaching had given her an instinct for trouble, and this document radiated the kind of danger that came not from immediate threat, but from long-buried truths finally clawing their way to the surface. She thought of that night in November 1981, of watching Albus place that tiny, sleeping child on the doorstep like a bottle of milk left for collection. She had objected then, had argued that the boy should be placed with a wizarding family who could love and protect him properly. But Albus had been firm, had spoken of blood protection and necessity and the greater good, and she had trusted his wisdom. How many times over the years had she wondered about Harry Potter? How many times had she pushed away the uncomfortable questions about his silence, his thinness, the way he flinched from unexpected touch? She had told herself that Albus knew best, that if there were problems, he would have acted. The subpoena suggested otherwise. 3 hours later, and 40 miles away, Hagrid was enjoying what he had hoped would be a peaceful afternoon, pint at the Three Broomsticks, when his world fell apart with the arrival of another official owl. Rosmerta had just set his drink down when the bird landed directly on the bar, scattering the peanuts and causing several nearby patrons to look up from their own conversations. "Official business, Hagrid," Rosmerta said quietly, recognizing the red leg band. "That's not the sort of post you want to keep waiting." Hagrid's massive hands were gentler with the parchment than anyone who knew only his reputation might expect, but his face went ashen as he read. The document slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor, where Rosmerta quickly retrieved it, her own expression growing concerned as she caught sight of the official seal. "What's it about, then?" she asked softly. "Harry," Hagrid said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They want to know about Harry." The words carried in the suddenly quiet pub, and Hagrid felt the weight of a dozen curious stares. He had never been good at keeping secrets, had always worn his emotions as openly as his wild hair and massive frame. The guilt that had gnawed at him for years was written clearly on his face now. The knowledge that he had been the one to take Harry from the ruins of Godric's Hollow, the one who had delivered him to Dumbledore without question. "I was just following orders," he said to no one in particular, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Dumbledore said it was for the best, said the boy needed to be kept safe." The silence that followed was broken only by the clink of glasses and the soft whisper of concerned conversations. Word would spread, Hagrid knew. By evening, half of magical Britain would know that the Department of Magical Law Enforcement was investigating Harry Potter's placement with his relatives. And they would all wonder, as he was wondering now, what had gone so terribly wrong. In a rented flat above a bookshop in Muggle London, Remus Lupin was grading essays when the knock came at his door. He had learned long ago to be cautious about unexpected visitors, but the witch who stood on his threshold wore the unmistakable robes of ministry enforcement and carried herself with the brisk efficiency of someone who delivered unpleasant news professionally. "Professor Lupin, I have a document that requires your immediate attention." The subpoena felt heavier than it should have in his hands, the parchment seeming to burn his fingers as he read. Behind the ministry witch, he caught sight of Nymphadora Tonks, climbing the narrow stairs, her own face grim as she clutched an identical document. "Watcher, Remus," she said, her usual cheerfulness notably absent. "Seems we're both wanted for questioning." The ministry witch departed without ceremony, leaving them standing in the cramped hallway with matching looks of confusion and growing dread. Remus gestured Tonks into his flat, noting absently how her hair had shifted to a subdued brown that matched her mood. "This is about Harry," Tonks said, settling into his worn armchair. "They want to know what we knew about his placement with those relatives of his." Remus nodded slowly, his mind already racing through the implications. "I've wondered about him over the years. The way he looked when he first arrived at Hogwarts, so thin and careful, like he expected to be hurt. And we never checked on him," Tonks said quietly. "Not once in all those years. Dumbledore said it was for his own protection, that contact with the magical world would compromise his safety. We trusted that." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own guilty memories. How many times had Remus wanted to reach out, to offer guidance to the son of his dearest friends? How many times had he pushed down the impulse, telling himself that Dumbledore's wisdom exceeded his own need for connection? "We need to contact the others," Remus said finally. "If they're calling us in for questioning, they're likely doing the same for everyone who was involved." Tonks nodded and drew her wand, the tip glowing silver as she prepared to send a Patronus message. Her wolf bounded from the wand tip and disappeared through the wall, carrying word of their subpoenas to Sirius at Grimmauld Place. Within minutes, similar silvery messengers were racing through the wizarding world, carrying news that made hearts sink and consciences stir. Arthur Weasley received word while working late at the Ministry, his face going pale as he realized the implications. Kingsley Shacklebolt got the news during an aura briefing and had to excuse himself to process what it meant. Molly Weasley was kneading bread when Remus's wolf appeared in her kitchen, and she sank onto a flour-dusted stool as the weight of 14 years of willful ignorance settled on her shoulders. By evening, Grimmauld Place buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that came before important battles. But this time, the enemy was not Death Eaters or dark creatures. This time, they were facing the possibility that their own actions, or lack thereof, had allowed a child to suffer, while they congratulated themselves on fighting the good fight. Sirius Black paced the length of the kitchen like a caged animal, his hands clenched into fists as he listened to the reports from arriving Order members. Each testimony painted the same picture. They had all been kept deliberately separate from Harry, all told that contact would compromise his safety, all trusting in Dumbledore's wisdom without question. "Where is he?" Sirius demanded, his voice rough with barely contained fury. "Where's Dumbledore? Why isn't he here explaining this to us?" Kingsley shook his head grimly. "No one's seen him since yesterday. His office at Hogwarts is empty, and he hasn't responded to any messages." "Convenient," Arthur said quietly from his seat at the scarred wooden table. "The moment questions start being asked about Harry's treatment, our fearless leader disappears." Molly wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron, her usual maternal warmth replaced by a devastating guilt. "We should have known. We should have checked on him. That poor boy, spending his summers with relatives who hate everything about what he is, and we just left him there. Because Dumbledore told us to," Sirius spat. "Because we trusted him when he said it was for Harry's own good. Blood protection," he said. "Necessary sacrifices for the greater good. And all the while, Harry was—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't voice the possibilities that had been haunting him since Remus's Patronus had arrived. Lupin entered the kitchen then, closely followed by Tonks, both wearing expressions that matched the grim mood already pervading the room. "Any word from Dumbledore?" Remus asked without preamble. "Nothing," Kingsley replied. "It's like he's vanished completely." "Or fled," Sirius said darkly, like someone who knows he's got questions to answer that he'd rather avoid. The room fell silent at that, the implications hanging heavy in the air. They had all followed Dumbledore without question, had trusted his judgment in matters large and small. The idea that he might have betrayed that trust, might have deliberately allowed Harry to suffer for reasons they couldn't fathom, was almost too large to process. "We need to be prepared," Arthur said finally. "If they're calling us in for testimony, they're conducting a serious investigation. We need to think about what we knew, what we suspected, and what we chose to ignore." "I never chose to ignore anything," Molly said fiercely. "I was told that contact with Harry would put him in danger. I was told that his safety depended on staying away from him." "And you believed it?" Sirius asked, though his voice held no accusation, only a hollow recognition of his own failures. "Of course I believed it," Molly snapped back. "It was Dumbledore. We all believed it." But even as the words left her mouth, she remembered the doubts that had crept in over the years. The way Harry had looked when he finally arrived at the Burrow for the first time, so thin and grateful for every kindness. The way he had eaten like he wasn't sure when his next meal would come. The careful politeness that spoke of a child who had learned not to make waves. She had noticed. They had all noticed. But noticing and acting were different things entirely, and they had all chosen the comfort of trust over the harder path of asking difficult questions. "So what do we do now?" Tonks asked, her hair shifting to a deep red that matched the anger building in her chest. "We can't change the past. We can't give Harry back his childhood or take away whatever he's suffered." "We tell the truth," Remus said, quietly. We testify honestly about what we knew, what we were told, and what we failed to do. And then we find a way to support him now. If he'll let us, Sirius added, his voice breaking slightly. If he can forgive us for failing him so completely. Outside, London continued its evening routine, oblivious to the crisis of conscience playing out in the hidden kitchen of Grimmauld Place. But inside, the members of the Order of the Phoenix sat with their shame and their fear, waiting for summons that would force them to confront the possibility that their greatest failure had been in trusting too completely in the wisdom of the man they had followed without question. The investigation was just beginning, but already the foundations of their world were shifting beneath their feet. Chapter 3. The Testimonies. Begin. The Department of Magical Law. Enforcement's formal interview rooms were designed to be intimidating without being cruel, their pale stone walls and heavy oak tables speaking of serious business conducted with proper gravity. Amelia Bones had chosen Interview Room 3 for its combination of comfort and authority, spacious enough to avoid claustrophobia, formal enough to remind witnesses of the gravity of their testimony. Professor McGonagall sat across from her with the rigid posture of someone who had spent decades commanding classrooms full of unruly teenagers, but her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her emerald robes. The quick quotes, quill scratched steadily in the corner, recording every word for the official record, its presence a reminder that this conversation would become evidence in whatever proceedings followed. Professor McGonagall, Amelia began, her voice carrying the professional warmth that had made her legendary among both witnesses and suspects. I want to thank you for responding to our subpoena so promptly. I know this cannot be easy for you. It is not, Minerva replied, her Scottish accent more pronounced than usual with stress. But I suppose it was inevitable that these questions would be asked eventually. Amelia leaned forward slightly, her trained instincts reading the complex mixture of guilt, dread, and relief in the older woman's expression. Let's begin with the night of November 1st, 1981. Can you describe your involvement in Harry Potter's placement with his relatives? McGonagall was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working at the fabric of her robes. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, but Amelia caught the tremor beneath the professional composure. I had been watching the Dursleys for the better part of a day, she said. Albus had asked me to observe them, to assess their suitability. I was horrified by what I saw. Vernon Dursley was a bully and a bigot, Petunia was bitter and resentful, and their son was already showing signs of being spoiled beyond redemption. When I reported my observations to Albus, I strongly recommended against placing Harry with them. What was Professor Dumbledore's response to your concerns? He dismissed them, McGonagall said flatly. He spoke of blood protection, of ancient magic that required Harry to be with his mother's relatives. He said that love would grow where it was needed most, that the Dursleys would come to care for Harry in time. Amelia made a note on her parchment. Did you believe that assessment? McGonagall's composure finally cracked, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. No, I did not. Everything I had observed suggested the opposite. But Albus was persuasive. He had saved us all from Grindelwald, had guided the magical world through its darkest hours. I trusted his wisdom over my own judgment. After Harry was placed with the Dursleys, did you ever attempt to check on his welfare? I wanted to, McGonagall said quietly. Many times over the years, I considered making inquiries, but Albus made it clear that any contact with the magical world would compromise Harry's safety. He said that Voldemort's followers would be watching for any sign of magical activity around the boy, that even a letter could lead them to his location. So for 10 years, until Harry received his Hogwarts letter, you had no contact with him whatsoever? None. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. We trusted that Albus was monitoring the situation, that he would intervene if intervention became necessary. We were wrong to trust so completely. An hour later, Hagrid filled the same chair with his massive frame, his wild hair and beard doing little to hide the devastation written across his features. The Keeper of Keys had always worn his emotions openly, and now his guilt radiated from him like heat from a forge. "I was the one who brought him there," he said, without preamble, his voice rough with unshed tears. "I was the one who took him from the ruins of his parents' house and delivered him to Dumbledore like a package." Amelia's voice was gentle, recognizing that this man's pain was genuine and profound. "Tell me about that night, Hagrid. What were your instructions?" "Dumbledore told me to collect the boy and bring him to Privet Drive. Said it was the safest place for him, that his aunt would take care of him." Hagrid wiped his eyes with the back of his massive hand. "I should have asked more questions. Should have wondered why a baby needed to be taken from the magical world entirely. But I trusted Dumbledore. I always trusted Dumbledore." "After you delivered Harry to his relatives, did Professor Dumbledore ever ask you to check on the boy's welfare?" "Never," Hagrid said, his voice breaking on the word. "In fact, he specifically told me not to. Said that any magical contact could compromise the protection around him. Said that even my presence near Privet Drive could alert Voldemort's followers to his location." "But you wanted to check on him?" Hagrid nodded miserably. "Every year around his birthday, I'd think about him. Wonder if he was happy, if he knew about his parents, if he understood what he meant to our world. But every time I considered visiting, I'd remember Dumbledore's warnings. I told myself I was keeping him safe by staying away." "When Harry arrived at Hogwarts for the first time, what was your impression of his condition?" "Too thin," Hagrid said immediately. "Much too thin, and too small for his age. He didn't know anything about the magical world, didn't even know who he was or what he'd done. And there was something in his eyes, like he expected to be hurt, like he'd learned not to hope for kindness." Amelia made careful notes, her professional facade hiding the growing fury that built with each testimony. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was worse than she had initially suspected. Arthur Weasley's testimony, given later that same day, painted an even more damning picture of systematic isolation. He sat forward in his chair, his thinning red hair catching the light from the magical lamps as he struggled to find words for his growing realization of failure. "I knew nothing," he said, his voice hollow with the weight of that admission. "For over a decade, I worked in the same building as the man responsible for Harry Potter's welfare, and I knew nothing about his actual living conditions." "Did Professor Dumbledore ever discuss Harry's placement with you?" "Only in the most general terms. He mentioned that the boy was safe with his relatives, that they were muggles who would keep him grounded in the non-magical world until he was ready to return to Hogwarts. It was presented as a positive thing. Harry would have a normal childhood, away from the pressures of fame and expectation." Amelia leaned back in her chair, studying Arthur's earnest expression. "As someone who works closely with Muggle affairs, didn't you find it odd that no one from the magical world was maintaining contact with Harry's guardians? Surely there would need to be some coordination, some communication about his eventual return to our world?" Arthur's face flushed with shame. "I should have asked those questions. As someone who understands Muggle culture, I should have realized that placing a magical child with Muggles who had no support or guidance was a recipe for problems. But Dumbledore's authority was absolute in such matters. If he said Harry was safe, then Harry was safe." "When you finally met Harry at your home during the summer before his second year, what was your impression?" "Grateful," Arthur said immediately. "Overwhelmingly grateful for every kindness, every meal, every moment of inclusion. He ate like he wasn't sure when he'd eat again, and he was so careful not to be any trouble. It reminded me of—" He paused, his expression growing troubled. "Reminded you of what?" of children I'd seen in the Muggle orphanages during my work with the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office. Children who had learned not to expect care, who treated kindness as something temporary and fragile. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Amelia made another note, the pattern of neglect and abandonment becoming clearer with each testimony. Molly Weasley's interview was perhaps the most emotionally charged of the day. She entered the room with the bustling energy that characterized her interactions with the world, but her usual warmth was dimmed by a guilt so profound it seemed to weigh down her very shoulders. "I wanted to mother him," she said, before Amelia could ask her first question. "From the moment I heard his story, I wanted to gather him up and feed him proper meals and make sure he knew he was loved. But I was told it would be dangerous." "Who told you it would be dangerous?" "Albus. He said that Harry's safety depended on remaining hidden from the magical world, that any attempt to contact him could lead Voldemort's followers to his location. He said that loving him meant leaving him alone." Amelia felt something cold settle in her stomach at those words. "Did you ever question that logic?" "I should have," Molly said, her voice thick with tears. "I should have demanded explanations, should have insisted on some form of oversight. But I was so afraid of doing something that might hurt him. So I stayed away, and I told myself I was protecting him by doing so. When Harry finally came to your home, how did he respond to your care?" "Like he'd never experienced it before," Molly whispered. "He was so grateful for everything, for meals, for a warm bed, for inclusion in family conversations. He helped with chores without being asked, never complained about anything, and seemed constantly surprised that we wanted him around." "Did that behavior concern you?" "Yes. But I told myself he was just shy, just overwhelmed by being in a magical household for the first time. I didn't want to believe what my instincts were telling me, that this was a child who had learned not to expect care, who treated love as something he had to earn, rather than something he deserved simply for existing." The final testimony of the day came from Kingsley Shacklebolt, whose position within the Aura Department had given him access to information that painted the most damning picture yet of Dumbledore's systematic isolation of Harry Potter. "There were standing orders," Kingsley said, his deep voice carefully controlled. "Orders that came directly from Dumbledore through the Minister's office. No magical surveillance of Privet Drive, no welfare checks, no official contact of any kind with Harry Potter or his guardians." Amelia's quill stopped moving across her parchment. "Standing orders to specifically exclude Privet Drive from any form of magical oversight?" "That's correct. The orders were classified at the highest level, accessible only to department heads and senior auras. They were presented as security measures. Any magical activity around Potter could alert hostile forces to his location. In your professional opinion, were these orders unusual?" Kingsley was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. "In my 15 years as an Aura, I have never encountered another case where the magical world completely severed contact with a magical child placed in Muggle care. Standard protocol requires regular welfare assessments, ongoing communication with guardians, and contingency plans for emergency situations. None of that existed for Harry Potter. What would you consider the normal procedure for a magical child in non-magical care? Monthly welfare checks by qualified social service personnel, quarterly reviews by the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures Child Welfare Division, and continuous monitoring charms to detect signs of abuse or neglect. Harry Potter received none of these protections." As the day's testimonies concluded, Amelia sat alone in her office, reviewing the transcripts, the weight of the evidence settling over her like a shroud. Each witness had painted the same picture from a different angle, a systematic campaign to isolate Harry Potter from the magical world, to ensure that no one was in a position to monitor his welfare or question his treatment. The pattern was too complete to be accidental, too comprehensive to be mere bureaucratic oversight. Someone had deliberately created a situation where Harry Potter could suffer in silence, where any abuse or neglect would go undetected and unaddressed, and that someone held the highest position of trust in the magical world. Amelia reached for a fresh sheet of parchment and began composing her next set of subpoenas. If Dumbledore thought that disappearing would end this investigation, he was about to learn otherwise. She would follow this trail wherever it led, no matter how powerful the person at its end. The boy who lived deserved justice, and Amelia Bones intended to make sure he got it. Chapter 4. The Missing Headmaster. The circular office that had served as the nerve center of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry for over half a century stood empty, its usual occupant conspicuously absent when the ministry officials arrived with their warrant. The spinning silver instruments that normally hummed with magical energy sat silent on their delicate tables, and even Fawkes's perch stood vacant, the phoenix apparently having departed with his master. Auror Dawlish stood in the doorway, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the abandoned office. Behind him, 2 junior Aurors waited for orders, their hands resting on their wands despite the apparent emptiness of the room. In his 15 years of service, Dawlish had never had cause to search Albus Dumbledore's private office, and the weight of that unprecedented action settled heavily on his shoulders. "Sir," one of the junior Aurors asked quietly, "should we begin the search?" Dawlish nodded slowly, stepping into the office with the careful respect due to a place of power, even when that power was absent. "Carefully," he instructed. "Document everything. Location of items, any signs of hasty departure, anything that might indicate his intentions or destination." The search revealed what Dawlish had feared they would find: evidence of a deliberately planned disappearance rather than a temporary absence. The headmaster's desk drawers stood open, their contents clearly rifled through with selective items removed. A leather traveling bag was missing from the wardrobe where it had hung for decades, according to a trembling house elf who had been summoned to assist with the inventory. Most telling of all was the absence of Dumbledore's personal magical instruments, the Deluminator, his collection of rare magical artifacts, and the pensieve that had held the memories of countless conversations and decisions. These were not the actions of a man called away on urgent business. These were the preparations of someone who did not intend to return anytime soon. The Phoenix-sent message had arrived at the ministry just hours before the search warrant was executed, its elegant script flowing across parchment that smoldered faintly with phoenix fire. The message was brief, formal, and utterly unconvincing to anyone who read it with a suspicious eye. "Urgent matters of international magical security require my immediate attention. I have been summoned by the International Confederation of Wizards to address a crisis that threatens the stability of magical governments across Europe. I regret that this emergency prevents me from responding to recent ministry inquiries, but the greater good demands my presence elsewhere. I shall return when circumstances permit. A P.W.B. Dumbledore, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, Order of Merlin First Class, Grand Sorcerer, Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards." Amelia Bones read the message for the 3rd time, her trained prosecutor's instincts picking apart every carefully chosen word. The timing was too convenient, the language too defensive, and the claims too vague to be credible. She reached for her quill and began drafting urgent communications to her contacts in international magical law enforcement. The response from the International Confederation of Wizards arrived by emergency owl within hours, its contents confirming Amelia's suspicions. No emergency session had been called, no crisis threatened magical governments. No one in any official capacity had summoned Albus Dumbledore for consultation or assistance. The man was fleeing. Even more damning was the report from Gringotts, delivered by a goblin accountant whose expression managed to convey both professional discretion and barely concealed disdain. "Director Ragnok has authorized me to inform you that Albus Dumbledore accessed his personal vault yesterday evening," the goblin said, his voice flat and businesslike. "He withdrew significant quantities of both wizarding currency and muggle money, as well as several rare magical artifacts that had been stored in our deepest vaults for safekeeping. How significant? Amelia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Enough to live comfortably in exile for many years, the goblin replied. The withdrawal was conducted according to proper procedures, but the timing and scope suggest preparation for extended absence from Britain. Amelia leaned back in her chair, the pieces of Dumbledore's flight crystallizing into undeniable clarity. A man innocent of wrongdoing didn't empty his vaults and flee the country when faced with questions about his decisions. A man confident in his choices didn't abandon his responsibilities and disappear into the international magical community. She reached for her emergency communication crystal and activated its connection to the Ministry's International Enforcement Division. "I need travel bans implemented immediately," she said to the witch who answered. "Albus Dumbledore is not to be permitted to enter or leave Britain through any magical means. Contact our treaty partners and inform them that he is wanted for questioning in connection with a child welfare investigation." "Director Bones," the witch replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Are you certain? The political implications of restricting Dumbledore's movements could be significant." "The political implications of allowing a suspected child abuser to escape justice would be far more significant," Amelia said firmly. "Implement the travel ban within the hour." Meanwhile, 40 miles away in the familiar chaos of the burrow, Harry Potter sat at the scarred wooden table in the Weasley kitchen, ostensibly helping Ginny with her summer essay on the historical applications of transfiguration, while actually trying to process the extraordinary conversation happening in hushed tones around him. Fred and George had arrived home that morning with news that had sent Mrs. Weasley into a frenzy of worry and speculation. They had been at Diagon Alley, conducting some unspecified business that probably involved their joke shop plans, when they overheard a conversation between two ministry workers in the Leaky Cauldron. "They're saying Amelia Bones has opened a full investigation," Fred said, his voice unusually serious as he recounted what they had heard. "About your placement with the Muggles, Harry. About whether proper procedures were followed." George nodded gravely. "Word is she's called in half the order for questioning. McGonagall, Hagrid, Dad, they've all been summoned to give testimony about what they knew and when they knew it." Harry's quill had stopped moving across his parchment, his essay forgotten as the implications of their words sank in. An investigation. Into his placement with the Dursleys. Into the years of cupboards and starvation and casual cruelty that he had never spoken about to anyone in the magical world. "What kind of investigation?" Ginny asked quietly, her own essay abandoned as she watched Harry's face grow pale. "The kind that asks uncomfortable questions," Fred said, his usual joking manner entirely absent. "The kind that wants to know why the most famous child in the wizarding world was left with relatives who hate magic, and everyone's been told to stay away from him for 15 years. Harry felt something cold and tight forming in his chest, a mixture of hope and terror that made it difficult to breathe. Hope, because someone was finally asking the questions that should have been asked years ago. Terror, because those questions would require answers, and the answers would lay bare truths he had spent years learning to hide. Mrs. Weasley bustled around the kitchen with nervous energy, her usual warm chattering replaced by anxious silence as she prepared lunch for the gathered family. She kept glancing at Harry with an expression that mixed guilt, worry, and a fierce protectiveness that he had never experienced before coming to the burrow. "Harry, dear," she said finally, setting a heaping plate in front of him, with the kind of abundance that still surprised him after years of careful rationing at Privet Drive. "If anyone from the ministry wants to talk to you about your home life, you know you can tell them the truth, don't you? You know that whatever you say, we'll support you?" Harry looked up at her, seeing the tears she was trying to hide, and felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. For 15 years, he had protected the Dursleys' secrets as carefully as they had protected their own reputation. He had learned to deflect questions about his home life, to present a facade of normalcy that kept uncomfortable inquiries at bay. But Mrs. Weasley was offering him something he had never had before: permission to tell the truth. Permission to stop protecting the people who had hurt him. Permission to hope that someone might actually care about what had happened to him behind the closed doors of number 4, Privet Drive. "I don't know if I can," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the usual noise of the Weasley household. "I don't know if anyone would believe me, or if they'd think it was my fault somehow." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Mrs. Weasley's sharp intake of breath. She set down the plate she was holding and crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides, pulling Harry into a fierce hug that smelled of flour and love and all the things he had learned to live without. "Oh, my dear boy," she whispered against his hair. "None of it was your fault. None of it. You were a child, and children should be protected and loved and cared for, not whatever they did to you." Harry felt tears he had been holding back for years, threatening to spill over. But before he could respond, an official-looking owl tapped at the kitchen window. Mrs. Weasley released him reluctantly and went to retrieve the letter, her face growing pale as she read its contents. "It's from Arthur," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "He's been called in for additional questioning tomorrow. They want to know about ministry protocols for magical children placed in Muggle care." Fred and George exchanged glances. "This is bigger than we thought," George said quietly. "If they're calling Dad back in, they're not just asking routine questions anymore." "They're building a case," Fred agreed. "The question is, a case against whom?" Harry knew the answer even before Mrs. Weasley spoke it aloud, her voice heavy with the weight of realization and betrayal. "Against Dumbledore," she said. "They're building a case against Dumbledore." The words hung in the air like a curse, transforming the comfortable chaos of the burrow into something charged with possibility and danger. Harry felt the careful foundations of his understanding shifting beneath him, the certainties he had built his life around beginning to crumble. Dumbledore, the great wizard who had saved him from Voldemort. Dumbledore, who had rescued him from the cupboard and brought him to Hogwarts. Dumbledore, who had also left him with the Dursleys in the first place and ensured that no one from the magical world ever checked on his welfare. For the first time in his life, Harry began to wonder if his rescue had been real, or if it had simply been another form of control dressed up as salvation. Outside the burrow, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and Harry couldn't tell if they were magical or natural. Perhaps, in a world where Dumbledore was being investigated for child endangerment, and the most trusted wizard alive had fled rather than answer questions about his decisions, the distinction no longer mattered. The truth was coming, whether Harry was ready for it or not, and with it would come the reckoning that had been 15 years in the making. Chapter 5. Testimonies of Doubt. The atmosphere in interview room 3 had grown heavier with each passing day, as though the weight of accumulated testimonies was pressing down on the very air itself. Amelia Bones had conducted hundreds of interrogations in her career, but few had carried the personal stakes and political ramifications of this investigation. Today's witness sat across from her, with the rigid posture of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of revealing nothing while appearing to cooperate fully. Severus Snape's black eyes fixed on her, with the kind of cold intensity that had intimidated countless students. But Amelia had faced down Death Eaters and dark wizards far more dangerous than one bitter professor. She met his gaze steadily, her own expression professionally neutral, as the quick quotes quill, prepared to record what might be the most revealing testimony yet. "Professor Snape," she began, "thank you for responding to our subpoena. I understand this is difficult given your relationship with Professor Dumbledore." "My relationship with Albus Dumbledore is complex," Snape replied, his voice carrying the silky menace that had made him legendary among Hogwarts students. "But it does not supersede my obligation to answer your questions truthfully." Amelia leaned forward slightly, sensing something beneath his carefully controlled facade. Let's begin with Harry Potter's time at Hogwarts. As his potions professor, you would have had regular opportunity to observe his physical and emotional state. What did you notice? Snape was quiet for a long moment, his pale fingers steepled before him on the table. When he spoke, his voice was carefully modulated, but Amelia caught the tremor of suppressed emotion beneath the surface. The boy was malnourished when he arrived, he said flatly. Undersized for his age, clearly unused to regular meals. His clothing was ill-fitting hand-me-downs, and he displayed the behavioral patterns common to children who have learned to expect punishment rather than praise. Did you report these observations to anyone? I mentioned them to Dumbledore during our first staff meeting of the term. Snape's expression grew even more shuttered. I was told that Harry's physical condition was the result of natural growth patterns, and that his behavioral quirks were simply shyness in an unfamiliar environment. Did you accept that explanation? Something flickered in Snape's dark eyes, gone almost before Amelia could register it. I accepted it because I was instructed to accept it. Dumbledore made it very clear that any excessive concern for Potter's welfare would be viewed as inappropriate given my history with his father. Amelia made a careful note. Were you given any specific instructions regarding your interactions with Harry Potter? I was told to maintain professional distance, to treat him as any other student, no better and no worse. When I expressed concern about certain indicators I observed, I was reminded that my judgment regarding anything Potter-related was compromised by old grudges, and that I should focus on teaching rather than playing counselor. What kind of indicators? Snape's composure cracked slightly, revealing a flash of something that might have been regret, flinching at sudden movements, gratitude for basic kindness that was excessive, an inability to advocate for himself when mistreated by other students, the way he hoarded food from the Great Hall as though he wasn't certain when he would eat again. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Amelia studied Snape's face, seeing the complex mixture of guilt and defensiveness warring in his expression. Professor Snape, in your professional opinion, were these behaviors consistent with a child who had experienced abuse or neglect? Yes, he said quietly. But I was ordered to ignore that professional opinion and trust in Dumbledore's greater wisdom. 2 hours later, Remus Lupin sat in the same chair, his worn robes and prematurely grey hair giving him an air of exhaustion that went beyond mere physical fatigue. Where Snape had been hostile and defensive, Lupin was simply broken, his grief and self-recrimination written plainly across his scarred features. I wanted to be part of Harry's life, he said without preamble, his voice rough with emotion. From the moment I learned he had survived, I wanted to honor James and Lily by helping to raise their son. But I was told it would be impossible. Who told you it would be impossible? Dumbledore. He explained that my condition made me unsuitable as a guardian, or even a regular presence in Harry's life. He said that the Ministry would never approve of a werewolf having access to the boy who lived, that it would create political complications that could endanger Harry's safety. Amelia felt a familiar cold anger settling in her stomach. Did you believe that assessment? Lupin's laugh was bitter and hollow. I wanted to believe it wasn't about my lycanthropy, that it was truly about Harry's protection. But as the years passed, and I remained isolated, not just from Harry but from any information about his welfare, I began to suspect that my condition was being used as a convenient excuse to keep another potential advocate away from him. Did you ever attempt to contact Harry despite these restrictions? Once. Lupin's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. When he was 7 years old. I sent a birthday card to Privet Drive, just a simple message letting him know that his parents' friends remembered him. 3 days later, Dumbledore summoned me to his office and informed me that my interference had compromised the protective wards around Harry's home. He said that any future contact could result in Voldemort's followers tracking Harry down and killing him. How did that make you feel? Terrified, Lupin admitted. The thought that my selfish desire to connect with James and Lily's son could get him killed was unbearable. So I stayed away. For 8 more years I stayed away and told myself I was protecting him. When you finally met Harry during his 3rd year, what was your impression? Lupin was quiet for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the glass of water on the table. Heartbreaking, he said finally. He was so eager for any connection to his parents, so grateful for attention from an adult who didn't seem to either worship or despise him. And there were signs that concerned me deeply. What kind of signs? He was too thin, too careful, too quick to apologize for things that weren't his fault. He moved like someone who expected to be hit, and he was pathetically grateful for basic kindness. When I gave him chocolate after the Dementor attack, he looked at me like I had given him the crown jewels. Amelia made careful notes, the pattern becoming clearer and more damning with each testimony. Did you share these concerns with anyone? I tried to discuss them with Dumbledore, but he assured me that Harry's behavior was within normal parameters for a boy his age, dealing with fame and adolescence. When I pressed the issue, he reminded me that my judgment regarding Harry might be colored by grief and guilt over his parents' deaths. The afternoon brought Nymphadora Tonks, whose usually vibrant energy was subdued to a dull ache of realization and regret. Her hair had shifted to a mousy brown that matched her mood, and her young face bore the weight of someone who had discovered that her trust had been systematically betrayed. I was specifically assigned to cases that would keep me away from Surrey, she said, her voice flat with suppressed anger. For 3 years, every mission, every surveillance assignment, every patrol I was given took me to the opposite end of the country from where Harry Potter was living. Did you find this assignment pattern unusual? At first, no. I was a junior aura, and junior auras go where they're sent. But when I mentioned to Kingsley that I'd never had a case in that area, he said something that made me think. He said that Surrey was off-limits for anyone connected to the Potter case. Amelia leaned forward. Off-limits how? No surveillance, no patrols, no investigations of any kind in Little Whinging or the surrounding areas. It was treated like a magical dead zone, a place where our authority simply didn't extend. Tonks's hair shifted to a deep red. I should have asked more questions, should have wondered why the home of the most important child in our world was completely unmonitored by magical law enforcement. Did you ever express these concerns to your superiors? Once, to Mad Eye. He told me that the security around Harry Potter was handled at levels far above my clearance, and that asking too many questions about it was a good way to find myself assigned to filing paperwork for the rest of my career. The most devastating testimony of the day came from an unexpected source. Arabella Figg arrived at the ministry, looking every inch the eccentric old woman she appeared to be, but her testimony revealed a web of threats and coercion that made Amelia's professional composure finally begin to crack. I was ordered to watch him, Mrs. Figg said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. For 15 years I watched that poor child suffer, and I was forbidden to help him. Who gave you these orders? Professor Dumbledore. He came to me the night after Harry was placed with the Dursleys and explained that I would be his eyes and ears, that I would monitor Harry's welfare and report any concerning developments. And did you report concerning developments? Mrs. Figg's composure finally broke completely. Every month for 15 years, I sent reports detailing Harry's treatment, the locked bedroom, the missed meals, the way his cousin and his friends used him as a target for their cruelty. I documented everything, hoping that someone would finally intervene. What response did you receive to these reports? I was told that Harry's treatment, while regrettable, was necessary to prevent him from developing an inflated ego that could make him vulnerable to dark influences. When I protested that the child was being actively harmed, I was threatened with obliviation if I interfered directly or contacted anyone else about what I was observing. The silence in the room was deafening. Amelia found herself staring at the elderly woman, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had just heard. "Mrs. Figg, are you telling me that Professor Dumbledore knew about Harry's abuse and chose not to intervene?" "I'm telling you that Professor Dumbledore received detailed reports about Harry's suffering for 15 years and repeatedly instructed me to continue watching without helping. He said that Harry needed to experience adversity to build character, that comfort and kindness would make him weak." The final testimony of the day came from Sirius Black, who appeared via secured flu connection from Grimmauld Place, his gaunt face bearing the weight of a realization so devastating it had left him barely functional. He had refused to come to the ministry in person, claiming that his fugitive status made it too dangerous. But Amelia suspected the real reason was that he couldn't bear to sit in the same building where his failure was being documented with such clinical precision. "I was in Azkaban," he said, his voice hollow and broken. "For 12 years I was locked away for a crime I didn't commit while Harry suffered, in a house less than 100 miles from where I was imprisoned. Mr. Black, when you finally encountered Harry during his 3rd year, did you notice anything concerning about his condition or behavior?" Sirius laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. Everything about him was concerning. He was too small, too careful, too grateful for any scrap of affection. When I offered him a home, he looked at me like I had offered him the world, as though the idea of being wanted was completely foreign to him. "Did you share these observations with Professor Dumbledore?" "I tried." Sirius's hands clenched into fists. "I told him that Harry seemed damaged in ways that went beyond losing his parents, that there were signs of systematic mistreatment. He assured me that my perceptions were skewed by guilt and that Harry was perfectly fine. How does it make you feel to learn that Professor Dumbledore had detailed knowledge of Harry's abuse throughout his childhood?" The question hung in the air for a long moment before Sirius responded, his voice breaking with rage and grief. "Like I failed him completely. Like every day I spent rotting in that cell, Harry was suffering in his own prison, and the man I trusted to protect him was standing by and letting it happen. Like everything I believed about justice and protection and doing what's right was a lie." As the day's testimonies concluded, Amelia sat alone in her office, surrounded by transcripts that painted a picture more horrifying than she had ever imagined. This wasn't simply a case of bureaucratic negligence or well-meaning mistakes. This was systematic, deliberate abuse, enabled and perpetuated by the most trusted figure in the magical world. The evidence was overwhelming, and it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Albus Dumbledore had knowingly allowed Harry Potter to suffer for 15 years, and he had systematically silenced or intimidated anyone who tried to help. The question now was not whether Dumbledore was guilty, but whether the magical world was ready to accept the truth about its greatest hero. Chapter 6. The Boy Who Lived to Tell. The witness chair seemed smaller when Harry Potter sat in it, his 15-year-old frame still carrying the lean build that spoke of years when food had been scarce and growth had been stunted. Amelia Bones had interviewed hundreds of abuse victims over her career, but none had carried the weight of expectation that surrounded the young man sitting across from her table, his green eyes reflecting a mixture of terror and determination that made her chest tight with professional sympathy. She had requested that several order members be present for Harry's testimony, both as emotional support and as witnesses to what she suspected would be the most crucial evidence in her investigation. Sirius sat in the corner of the room, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Mrs. Weasley occupied another chair, a handkerchief already twisted between her fingers, despite the fact that Harry had not yet spoken a word. Professor McGonagall sat ramrod straight beside the wall, her expression carefully controlled, but her eyes bright with barely suppressed emotion. "Harry!" Amelia began, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had made her legendary among both victims and perpetrators. "I want you to know that everything you say here is protected by magical law. No one can use your testimony to harm you, and no one outside this room will have access to your words without your explicit permission." Harry nodded slowly, his throat working as he swallowed nervously. "I understand." "Good. Now, I need you to tell me about your life at Privet Drive. Start wherever feels comfortable, and take your time. There's no rush." Harry was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands where they rested in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. But in the silent room, every word carried with devastating clarity. "They put me in the cupboard under the stairs when I was small," he said. "It was my bedroom until I was 11. There wasn't a light, and it wasn't big enough to stand up in. But it was mine. The only space that was mine." Mrs. Weasley made a soft sound of distress, quickly muffled by her handkerchief. Amelia made a careful note and waited for Harry to continue. "I don't remember them ever explaining why I was there. It was just where I belonged, in the dark, out of the way, where I couldn't bother them or remind them of what they didn't want to remember." Harry's voice grew steadier as he spoke, as though the simple act of finally telling the truth was giving him strength. "When I cried as a baby, Uncle Vernon would bang on the door and shout that freaks didn't deserve comfort. When I got older and tried to ask questions, Aunt Petunia would lock me in for days." "Days?" Amelia asked gently. "Usually 3 or 4. Sometimes longer if I'd done something really wrong, like accidentally making something happen. The magic," he clarified, though his voice carried no pride in the word. "When strange things happened around me, they blamed me for it. Said I was a freak trying to hurt normal people." Sirius made a sound like a wounded animal. Harry looked up at him, his expression apologetic rather than seeking sympathy. "They weren't wrong, though. Things did happen when I was upset or scared. Windows would break, or Aunt Petunia's hair would turn strange colors, or Dudley's gang would find themselves stuck in trees they couldn't climb down from. I never meant for it to happen, but it did, and they had to punish me for it." "Harry," Professor McGonagall said softly, her Scottish accent thick with emotion, "accidental magic is completely normal for magical children. It's not something that requires punishment." Harry shrugged, a gesture that spoke of years of accepting explanations that made no sense to anyone but him. "I know that now. But then, it just meant more time in the cupboard, longer periods without meals, extra chores to make up for the trouble I'd caused." "Tell me about the meals," Amelia said, her professional instincts guiding her toward the systematic documentation of what she was increasingly certain would be evidence of criminal neglect. "There weren't many," Harry said matter-of-factly. "Breakfast was usually just toast crusts or cereal that had gone stale. Lunch was whatever was left over from Dudley's meal the night before, if there was anything left over. Dinner was inconsistent. It depended on whether I'd done something wrong that day, or whether Aunt Petunia remembered I existed." "How often did you go without food entirely?" Harry considered the question seriously. "In the summers, probably 2 or 3 times a week. During the school year, less often because they had to maintain the pretense that I was being cared for. The neighbors might ask questions if I collapsed from hunger at school." The silence that followed was deafening. Amelia found herself staring at the young man across from her, trying to reconcile his calm recitation of systematic starvation with the fact that he was speaking of his own childhood. "Harry," she said gently, "did your aunt and uncle ever strike you?" "Not often," Harry replied, and Amelia caught the significance of his phrasing. Not never, but not often. Uncle Vernon had a temper, especially when he'd been drinking or when work had been particularly stressful, but usually they preferred other methods. "What kind of other methods?" "Isolation, extra chores, being locked in my room for days at a time. Harry's voice remained steady, but Amelia noticed his hands had begun to tremble slightly. When I was 12, they put bars on my bedroom window and installed locks on the outside of the door. They told the neighbors I was attending a school for incurably criminal boys and that the security measures were necessary to protect the community. Mrs. Weasley's sob was audible this time, and she pressed her handkerchief to her mouth as though she could somehow take back the sound. Harry glanced at her with that same apologetic expression. "It wasn't so bad," he said, apparently attempting comfort. "I had learned to be very quiet by then, and I had learned not to expect much. The worst part was usually the uncertainty, not knowing how long it would last or what I could do to make it stop." "Harry," Amelia said, her voice carefully controlled, "I need you to tell me about the summer before your second year at Hogwarts. I have reports of magical interference that resulted in additional punishment. Can you describe what happened?" Harry's composure finally cracked slightly, a flash of something that might have been old terror crossing his features. "Dobby," he said quietly, "a house elf came to warn me about dangers at Hogwarts. He used magic in the house to try to prevent me from returning to school. Uncle Vernon thought I had done it." "What was your uncle's response?" "He was furious, more furious than I'd ever seen him. He installed the bars that night and told me I would never return to my freak school again. He said that since I wanted to use my unnaturalness to embarrass him in front of his important dinner guests, I could see how I liked being treated like the dangerous criminal I clearly was." "How long were you locked in your room?" "Nearly 2 weeks. Ron and the twins had to break me out through the window." Harry's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I was so grateful to see them that I cried. I hadn't cried in years before that, but I couldn't stop. I think it scared them." Amelia made careful notes, her professional facade barely concealing the fury building in her chest. Beside her, the quick quotes quill scratched steadily, recording every word of what was becoming the most damning testimony she had ever heard. "Harry, I need to ask about your cousin Dudley and his friends. Did they ever target you for bullying or harassment?" For the first time since he had begun speaking, Harry actually smiled, though it was a bitter expression that held no warmth. "Dudley hunting was a neighborhood sport. He and his gang would chase me through the streets, and if they caught me," he shrugged again, "it was just what happened. The teachers at school knew, but they also knew that the Dursleys donated generously to school programs, and that I was just the unwanted nephew who caused trouble." "Were you ever seriously injured during these incidents?" "Define seriously," Harry said, with a dry humor that was more heartbreaking than tears would have been. "Broken ribs, black eyes, split lips, but nothing that required hospitalization. Nothing that couldn't be explained as the result of my clumsiness or unfortunate tendency to fall downstairs." Sirius made another sound, half sob and half growl, and Harry looked at him with genuine concern. "It's all right," Harry said softly. "I survived. I learned how to run fast, how to hide, how to be invisible when I needed to be. It made me stronger in some ways." "Harry," Amelia said, her voice thick with emotion despite her professional training, "do you understand that none of what you've described was normal? That children should never have to endure what you endured?" Harry was quiet for a long moment, his green eyes reflecting a complexity of emotion that seemed far too old for his 15 years. "I understand that now," he said finally. "But for most of my life, it was just life. I didn't have anything to compare it to. I thought all unwanted children lived the way I lived, and that the difference was just that most children were wanted. When did you first realize that your treatment was unusual?" "When I came to Hogwarts and saw how the other students talked about their families. When I went to the burrow and Mrs. Weasley hugged me just because I was hungry. When Professor Lupin gave me chocolate after the Dementor attack and didn't expect anything in return." Harry's voice cracked slightly. when I realized that kindness wasn't something I had to earn. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Mrs. Weasley's quiet weeping and the scratching of the quick quotes quill. Amelia found herself struggling to maintain her professional composure in the face of such systematic cruelty, delivered with such matter-of-fact acceptance. "Harry," she said finally, "is there anything else you think I should know about your treatment at Privet Drive?" Harry considered the question seriously. "They never told me I was loved. Not once, in 15 years. They never told me I was wanted, or valued, or that my life mattered. They made sure I knew that I was a burden, an obligation they had accepted but resented." He looked directly at Amelia, his green eyes holding a strength that seemed impossible given what he had endured. "But they also never broke me completely. I think that might have frustrated them sometimes." As Harry's testimony concluded, Amelia sat in the suddenly quiet room and felt the weight of 15 years of systematic abuse settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Every suspicion she had harbored, every uncomfortable question that had driven her to begin this investigation, paled in comparison to the reality that Harry had just laid bare with such devastating simplicity. This was not a case of bureaucratic oversight or well-meaning mistakes. This was criminal neglect and abuse, enabled and perpetuated by the very system that should have protected the wizarding world's most vulnerable child, and the man who had orchestrated that system sat at the pinnacle of magical society, celebrated as the greatest wizard of their age. Amelia looked around the room at the faces of the Order members who had listened to Harry's testimony. Each wore an expression of horror, guilt, and dawning understanding that their trust had been not merely misplaced, but actively exploited to facilitate cruelty. "Harry," she said softly, "thank you for your courage in telling us the truth. I know this wasn't easy." Harry nodded, his composure still intact despite the emotional weight of his revelations. "Will it help? Will it make a difference?" "Yes," Amelia said with absolute conviction. "It will make all the difference." As Harry left the interview room, accompanied by Mrs. Weasley, who seemed unable to stop touching his shoulder as though to reassure herself that he was real and safe, Amelia remained seated at the table, staring at the transcripts that would change everything. The boy who lived had finally told his story. Now it was time for justice to be served. Chapter 7. International Incident. The ornate chambers of the French Ministry of Magic buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that accompanied unprecedented diplomatic crises. Minister Amelie Delacour stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, her elegant robes rustling softly as she gazed out at the magical district of Paris, where the morning light cast long shadows between the ancient buildings that housed the oldest magical government in Europe. Behind her desk sat Albus Dumbledore, looking remarkably composed for a man who had fled his own country under cover of darkness. His blue eyes held their customary twinkle, though Minister Delacour's trained diplomatic instincts detected something brittle beneath the surface, a carefully maintained facade that spoke of a man under tremendous pressure. "Albus," she said, turning from the window to face him directly. "You understand the position this puts the French ministry in? You are asking us to grant diplomatic asylum to someone who is wanted for questioning by the British Department of Magical Law Enforcement." "I am asking for protection from a politically motivated persecution," Dumbledore replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence that had made him legendary in international magical circles. "The investigation being conducted by Director Bones is based on unfounded accusations and personal vendettas. As supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, I surely deserve better than to be subjected to a witch hunt disguised as justice." Minister Delacour studied him carefully, her expression neutral despite the turmoil of conflicting loyalties warring in her chest. Dumbledore's contributions to international magical security were legendary, his defeat of Grindelwald still celebrated throughout Europe. But the preliminary reports she had received from her contacts in the British ministry painted a picture that was difficult to reconcile with the revered figure sitting before her. "The preliminary evidence suggests this is more than mere political persecution," she said carefully. "The testimonies being gathered appear to indicate systematic negligence in the care of a magical child." "These are serious accusations, Albus. Accusations made by individuals who have their own reasons to discredit me," Dumbledore responded smoothly. "Severus Snape holds old grudges that cloud his judgment. Sirius Black is a convicted criminal with questionable mental stability. The Weasley family has always resented authority. Their testimonies are hardly reliable sources of objective truth." Before Minister Delacour could respond, her office door burst open without ceremony, admitting her chief international liaison, whose normally composed demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled urgency. "Minister," he said, slightly out of breath, "we've received an emergency communication from the British Ministry. Director Bones is requesting immediate access to our diplomatic channels to present evidence regarding Professor Dumbledore's case." Minister Delacour felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What kind of evidence?" "Formal testimony transcripts, authenticated magical records, and what she describes as documentation of systematic child endangerment spanning 15 years. She's requesting a full diplomatic hearing under the International Convention for the Protection of Magical Children." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Dumbledore's carefully maintained composure slipped slightly, revealing a flash of something that might have been genuine fear. The International Convention for the Protection of Magical Children was not a political document that could be dismissed with diplomatic niceties. It was a binding magical treaty that superseded national boundaries and individual reputations. "I see," Minister Delacour said quietly. "And the British Ministry's position?" "Minister Fudge has officially requested our cooperation in the matter, though our sources suggest he is under tremendous pressure, both domestically and internationally, to distance himself from Professor Dumbledore's case." 3 hours later, the emergency session of the International Confederation of Wizards convened in the Grand Assembly Hall beneath the streets of Paris, its ancient stones bearing witness to the kind of crisis that had not been seen since the dark days of Grindelwald's rise. Representatives from 17 magical governments sat in judgment as Amelia Bones presented her evidence with the methodical precision that had made her legendary among international law enforcement circles. The testimony transcripts hung in the air before the assembly, illuminated by magical light that made every damning word clearly visible to the gathered representatives. Harry Potter's voice echoed through the chamber, his matter-of-fact recitation of abuse made even more devastating by the formal, clinical setting of international justice. The evidence presented indicates systematic isolation and abuse spanning 15 years, Amelia said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber. The accused was not merely negligent in his duties as guardian. He actively prevented others from monitoring the child's welfare and threatened those who attempted to report concerning conditions. The representative from the German Ministry of Magic leaned forward in his seat. "Director Bones, these are serious accusations against a figure of enormous international standing. You are asking us to believe that Albus Dumbledore, the defeater of Grindelwald, deliberately facilitated the abuse of the child he was responsible for protecting. I am asking you to review the evidence and reach your own conclusions," Amelia replied calmly. "The magical transcripts cannot be falsified. The testimony has been given under veritaserum, and the pattern of behavior documented over 15 years speaks for itself." In the viewing gallery reserved for international press, quick quotes quills scratched frantically as reporters from magical newspapers across Europe documented every word of the unprecedented hearing. The story was already spreading beyond the confines of the assembly hall, transmitted by magical communication networks to every corner of the international wizarding community. The Daily Prophet's international correspondent had been among the first to file her report, and her words were already appearing in emergency editions across Britain. Dumbledore seeks asylum. International crisis. erupts as evidence of child abuse presented to Confederation. But it was the response from the smaller, independent publications that truly captured the seismic shift in public opinion. The Quibbler, despite its reputation for eccentricity, ran a devastating analysis of the evidence that was being quoted by more serious publications across Europe. Even the traditionally conservative German wizard journal Der Zauberstab published an editorial questioning whether the international magical community had been too quick to grant blind trust to figures of authority. Back in London, Minister Cornelius Fudge paced the length of his office like a caged animal, his bowler hat askew and his usually pristine appearance dishevelled by hours of crisis management. The international pressure was unlike anything he had experienced in his political career, and the domestic implications were becoming more severe with each passing hour. "Sir," his senior aide ventured carefully, "the International Confederation is demanding a formal response to the charges against Professor Dumbledore. They're threatening to invoke Article 7 of the Child Protection Convention if we don't cooperate fully with the investigation." Fudge stopped pacing, his face pale. Article 7 meant international oversight of British magical child welfare services, a humiliation that no Minister for Magic had ever been forced to endure. "What are our options?" "Limited, sir. The evidence presented by Director Bones appears to be beyond dispute, and our international allies are making it clear that protecting Professor Dumbledore could jeopardize our standing in the global magical community." "But this is Dumbledore," Fudge said helplessly, "the man who defeated Grindelwald, who has guided our world through its darkest hours. Surely his past service counts for something." "It does, sir, which is why the international community is taking these accusations so seriously. If someone of Dumbledore's stature can commit such acts without accountability, it calls into question the fundamental principles of magical governance." The transformation in international opinion was swift and devastating. The Norwegian Ministry of Magic issued a statement expressing grave concerns about the evidence presented. The Italian magical government called for a full review of all international treaties involving British magical law enforcement. Even the traditionally diplomatic Swiss Magical Authority released a carefully worded statement emphasizing their commitment to child protection over political considerations. Perhaps most damaging of all was the response from the magical communities that had suffered under Grindelwald's reign. The Austrian magical government, still scarred by memories of dark wizards who justified atrocities in the name of the greater good, issued a statement that sent shockwaves through the international community. The evidence presented suggests a pattern of behavior that prioritizes abstract ideology over the welfare of individual children. We have seen before what happens when great wizards believe themselves above the moral constraints that govern ordinary people. We will not make the mistake of blind trust again. In the refugee camps and displaced magical communities across Eastern Europe, Harry Potter's story resonated with particular power. These were people who had lost everything to wizards who claimed to be acting for the greater good, who understood viscerally the cost of allowing powerful figures to operate without oversight or accountability. The international magical press began investigating their own country's child welfare systems, asking uncomfortable questions about oversight and accountability that had been ignored for decades. The German ministry was forced to address long-standing complaints about the treatment of magical children in non-magical care. The French government launched a review of their own placement procedures. The Italian authorities began investigating historical cases of magical child abuse that had been quietly buried by influential families. Harry Potter's story had become more than just an indictment of one man's failures. It had become a catalyst for examining the fundamental structures of magical society and asking whether they truly protected those who were most vulnerable. As the emergency session of the International Confederation entered its third day, the weight of global opinion had shifted decisively against Dumbledore. The French minister, who had initially offered him protection based on his reputation, now found herself in the untenable position of harboring someone who was rapidly becoming seen as an international pariah. "Albus," she said, during a private meeting in the secure chambers beneath the French ministry, "I'm afraid the situation has become untenable. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and continuing to offer you protection would compromise France's relationships with our international partners." Dumbledore sat in silence for a long moment, his hands folded before him on the table. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual commanding presence. "I acted in what I believed to be the best interests of both Harry Potter and the wizarding world," he said quietly. "My decisions may have been imperfect, but they were made with the burden of knowledge that no one else possessed." "That may be true," Minister Delacour replied sadly, "but intentions, however noble, cannot excuse the harm that has been documented. The international magical community cannot turn a blind eye to child abuse, regardless of who commits it or why." The final blow came from an unexpected source. The magical government of Bulgaria, still rebuilding after years of corruption and dark wizard influence, issued a statement that crystallized the global consensus. "We have learned the hard way that no one, regardless of their past service or present position, can be permitted to operate above the law. The welfare of children must always take precedence over the reputation of adults. We stand with the investigation being conducted by Director Bones and call for full accountability for all those responsible for failing to protect Harry Potter." As news of international support for the investigation spread throughout the magical world, Dumbledore's position became increasingly untenable. The man who had spent decades building a reputation as the greatest wizard of his age now found himself isolated, abandoned by the very international community he had once led. The boy who had survived 15 years of abuse in a cupboard under the stairs had finally found his voice, and the world was listening. Chapter 8. Allies and Enemies. The Wizengamot chambers had never felt more charged with political tension than they did on the morning when Augusta Longbottom rose to address the assembly, her vulture-topped hat slightly askew, and her usually stern expression replaced by something approaching volcanic fury. The emergency session had been called ostensibly to discuss Britain's response to the international crisis, but everyone present understood that they were really there to decide whether to stand behind Albus Dumbledore or abandon him to face justice alone. "For too long," Augusta declared, her voice carrying across the ancient chamber with the authority of someone who had survived wars and buried heroes, "we have allowed our reverence for past glories to blind us to present failures. The evidence presented by Director Bones is overwhelming, and our response will define whether we are a society governed by law or by the whims of powerful men." The ripple of murmurs that followed her words revealed the deep fractures that had emerged within the magical government's highest body. Some members nodded in agreement, their faces grim with the weight of uncomfortable truths. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly torn between loyalty to Dumbledore and the mounting evidence of his failures. Lucius Malfoy sat in the front row, his platinum hair gleaming in the magical light, his expression one of barely concealed satisfaction. He had not spoken yet, but his presence radiated the kind of political opportunism that thrived in moments of institutional crisis. When he finally rose to address the assembly, his voice carried the silky menace that had made him legendary in the corridors of power. "While I find myself in the unusual position of agreeing with Madame Longbottom," he said with calculated precision, "I must wonder what other oversights in judgment our esteemed former chief warlock may have made over the years. Perhaps it is time for a comprehensive review of all decisions made under his influence." The suggestion hung in the air like a curse, and several Wizengamot members paled as they contemplated the implications. Dumbledore's influence had shaped magical policy for decades, and a thorough investigation of his decisions could implicate dozens of previously respected officials in negligence or worse. "That's enough, Lucius," came a sharp voice from the back of the chamber. Amelia Bones stood in the observation gallery, her expression thunderous as she watched the political vultures circling the crisis she had worked so hard to expose. "This investigation is about Harry Potter's welfare. not about settling old political scores or advancing personal agendas. But even as she spoke, Amelia knew that the forces she had unleashed were beyond her control. The evidence against Dumbledore had created a power vacuum in magical Britain, and the various factions were already positioning themselves to fill it. Meanwhile, in the depths of the Ministry, darker forces were at work. Senior Undersecretary Dolores Umbridge sat behind her pink-decorated desk, surrounded by files that bore the official seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Her toad-like features were arranged in an expression of bureaucratic concern as she reviewed the investigation documents with the kind of attention usually reserved for identifying ways to subvert unwelcome truths. "There must be some procedural irregularity we can exploit," she said to the nervous-looking assistant who stood before her desk. "Director Bones may believe she has built an airtight case, but all investigations can be undermined if one knows where to look for weaknesses." "Ma'am," the assistant ventured carefully, "the evidence appears to be quite comprehensive. The magical transcripts are authenticated, the testimonies were given under veritaserum, and the international community is watching very closely." Umbridge's smile was as sweet as poisoned honey. "My dear boy, you clearly don't understand how the game is played. Evidence is only as strong as the investigators who gather it, and investigators can be discredited in various ways. A few questions about Director Bones's motivations, perhaps some suggestions about her relationship with certain political factions, and suddenly her objectivity becomes questionable." The plan that emerged from Umbridge's office over the following hours was as insidious as it was predictable. Word began to spread through the Ministry's corridors that Amelia Bones had personal grudges against Dumbledore, that her investigation was motivated by ambition rather than justice. Anonymous reports surfaced questioning her methods, her competence, and her right to pursue such a politically sensitive case. But Amelia had not survived 30 years in magical law enforcement by being naive about political warfare. When the attacks began, she was ready for them, supported by an unexpected coalition of allies who had emerged from the shadows to stand with her. The first surprise came from Cornelius Fudge himself, who had spent years being intimidated by Dumbledore's authority, but now found himself liberated by the truth about his former mentor's failures. In a closed-door meeting with his senior advisors, Fudge displayed a backbone that few had suspected he possessed. "I will not allow this ministry to become complicit in covering up child abuse," he declared, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and determination. "Whatever the political cost, whatever the damage to our international relationships, we will cooperate fully with Director Bones's investigation." The second surprise came from an even more unexpected source. Percy Weasley, ambitious and rule-bound in equal measure, had initially been torn between his loyalty to the Ministry hierarchy and his growing horror at the evidence against Dumbledore. But when Umbridge approached him with suggestions about undermining the investigation, something in Percy's rigid moral framework snapped into place. "With respect, Senior Undersecretary," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet determination that had made him prefect and head boy. "I believe that upholding the law is more important than protecting the reputation of any individual, regardless of their past service." The refusal to participate in the cover-up marked Percy as either courageous or foolish, depending on one's perspective. But it also marked him as someone whose integrity could not be bought or compromised, a rare quality in the current political climate. Perhaps the most significant development occurred far from the corridors of power, in the comfortable sitting room of Bones Manor, where Harry Potter sat across from Susan Bones, 2 cups of tea growing cold between them as they navigated the complex emotions surrounding the investigation that had turned both their lives upside down. "I keep thinking about all the times you came back to Hogwarts looking so thin," Susan said quietly, her blonde hair falling across her face as she stared into her teacup. "All the times you were so careful about everything, like you expected to be punished for breathing wrong. We all noticed, but we never said anything." Harry shrugged, the gesture so familiar that Susan realized she had seen him deflect concern this way hundreds of times. "It wasn't your responsibility. It wasn't anyone's responsibility except the adults who were supposed to be watching out for me." "But that's just it," Susan said, looking up at him with eyes that held a determination very similar to her aunt's. "It should have been everyone's responsibility. We're all part of the same community, aren't we? When someone in our community is being hurt, all of us have a duty to notice, to care, to do something about it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Amelia, who entered the sitting room with the weary expression of someone who had spent the day fighting battles on multiple fronts. She sank into an armchair with a grateful sigh, accepting the fresh cup of tea that Susan pressed into her hands. "How are you holding up, Harry?" she asked, studying his face with the professional concern that had made her legendary among victims of crime. "I know this can't be easy, having your private pain made so public." "It's strange," Harry admitted. "For years I wanted someone to notice, someone to ask the right questions. Now that it's happening, part of me wants to hide from it all." "That's perfectly normal," Amelia assured him. "But I want you to know that you're not alone in this. The support for this investigation has been overwhelming, and much of it is coming from people who understand that justice delayed is justice denied." She was referring to the flood of letters that had arrived at the ministry from ordinary witches and wizards across Britain, expressing their support for the investigation and their horror at Harry's treatment. The response from the magical community had been swift and decisive, with public opinion polls showing overwhelming support for pursuing the case, regardless of the political consequences. More surprising were the offers of protection and support that had come from unexpected sources. The Goblin Nation, through their official representatives at Gringotts, had offered Harry sanctuary within their underground strongholds if he ever felt threatened. The centaur herds of the Forbidden Forest had sent word through Hagrid that they considered Harry to be under their protection. Even some of the more progressive pure-blood families had quietly reached out to offer their support, recognizing that the principles at stake transcended traditional political divisions. But with support came danger, and Amelia had not failed to notice the shadowy figures who seemed to be taking an unhealthy interest in the investigation. Death Eater families who remained free and influential were clearly viewing the chaos as an opportunity to advance their own agendas, and their attempts to exploit the situation had become increasingly bold. "I've received some concerning intelligence reports," Amelia said carefully, glancing between Harry and Susan. "There are individuals who would prefer that this investigation never reach its conclusion, and they may attempt to interfere directly rather than relying on political maneuvering." Susan straightened in her chair, her expression growing fierce. "Are you saying someone might try to hurt Harry to stop the investigation?" "I'm saying that we need to be prepared for that possibility," Amelia replied, "which is why I've arranged for additional security measures. Auras will be posted discreetly around the manor. And Harry, I'm afraid you won't be able to leave the grounds without an escort." Harry's expression grew troubled. "I don't want to be a prisoner again, even if it's for my own protection." "You won't be," Susan said firmly, reaching across the space between their chairs to squeeze his hand. "You'll be a member of our family who happens to have some extra security precautions. There's a difference." The simple gesture and declaration meant more to Harry than all the official statements of support combined. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing what it meant to have someone his own age stand beside him, not because of his fame or his story, but simply because it was the right thing to do. As evening fell over Bones Manor, the three of them sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the battles that lay ahead. The investigation that had begun with a few uncomfortable questions had evolved into a fundamental challenge to the structures of magical society, and none of them harbored any illusions about the forces arrayed against them. But they also understood that they were no longer fighting alone. The truth had allies, and sometimes that was enough to tip the scales of justice in favor of those who had been denied it for far too long. Outside the manor's protective wards, shadows moved in the darkness, and the war for Harry Potter's future entered a new and more dangerous phase. But inside, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand with him regardless of the cost, Harry Potter felt something he had never experienced before, the unshakable conviction that he was worth fighting for. The boy who had lived in cupboards and silence had finally found his voice, and with it he had found a family willing to help him use it. Chapter 9. The Blood Protection Lie. The ancient magic specialist who entered interview room 3 carried with her the weight of centuries, her silver hair twisted into an elaborate braid that spoke of old traditions and older knowledge. Professor Bathsheba Babbling had spent 40 years teaching ancient runes at Hogwarts, but her expertise extended far beyond academic instruction into the deepest mysteries of magical theory that most modern wizards had long since forgotten. Amelia Bones watched her settle into the witness chair with the kind of professional respect reserved for those whose knowledge could reshape entire investigations. Beside her, the Gringotts curse-breaker sat with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to diffusing magical traps that could kill with a single misstep. Griphook's dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed to penetrate directly to the heart of matters that lesser minds struggled to comprehend. The gallery was fuller than it had been for any previous testimony, packed with order members, ministry officials, and international observers whose presence underscored the global significance of what was about to be revealed. Harry sat in the front row between Mrs. Weasley and Susan, his face pale but determined, as he prepared to hear expert analysis of the magical theory that had shaped his entire life. "Professor Babbling," Amelia began, her voice carrying across the hushed room, "you have reviewed all the evidence presented regarding Harry Potter's placement with his relatives, including the magical protections that were supposedly implemented to ensure his safety. In your expert opinion, were the conditions imposed on Harry necessary to maintain those protections?" Professor Babbling adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles and consulted the thick sheaf of parchment before her. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had devoted her life to understanding magic in its purest and most ancient forms. "Director Bones, I must begin by stating unequivocally that everything we have been told about the requirements for blood ward maintenance is fundamentally incorrect. The protective charm cast by Lily Potter's sacrifice does not require neglect, abuse, or isolation to remain effective. In fact, such conditions actively undermine the very foundation upon which the protection is built." A collective intake of breath rippled through the gallery. Harry's hands clenched in his lap, and Mrs. Weasley reached over to cover them with her own warm fingers. "Can you explain the actual requirements for maintaining blood ward protections?" Amelia asked. "Blood wards are powered by the emotional resonance of familial love," Professor Babbling replied, her voice growing stronger as she delved into her area of expertise. "They are strengthened by care, nurtured by affection, and sustained by the genuine concern of blood relatives for the protected individual. The notion that such protections require suffering or isolation contradicts every fundamental principle of protective magic." Griphook leaned forward in his chair, his goblin features sharp with professional interest. "If I may add to Professor Babbling's testimony, Director Bones, the Cursebreaker Division of Gringotts has extensive experience with blood ward protections, particularly those implemented to protect valuable family assets. In every case we have studied, the strength of the protection correlates directly with the emotional health and well-being of the protected individual. Are you saying that Harry's abuse actually weakened the protections supposedly placed around him?" "That is exactly what I'm saying," Griphook replied flatly. "The systematic mistreatment documented in these testimonies would have created magical dissonance that actively degraded the protective barriers. A child raised with love and care by blood relatives would have been exponentially safer than one subjected to neglect and cruelty." The implications of this testimony were staggering, and Amelia could see the shocked recognition dawning on faces throughout the gallery. If the experts were correct, then Dumbledore had not merely failed to prevent Harry's abuse, he had actively chosen a course of action that made Harry less safe while claiming it was necessary for his protection. "Professor Babbling," Amelia continued, "in your professional opinion, were there alternative arrangements that could have provided equal or superior protection for Harry Potter?" "Numerous alternatives," the ancient magic specialist replied without hesitation. "The simplest would have been to place Harry with blood relatives who were prepared to love and care for him properly. The Dursleys could have been educated about the magical world and supported in their guardianship duties. If that proved impossible, the blood ward could have been extended to include other family members through established ritual procedures." "What other family members?" "Any witch or wizard, with even distant blood ties to Lily Potter, could have been ritually adopted into the protective ward structure. The Evans family tree includes several magical branches that were never explored as options. More significantly, the ward could have been transferred to individuals who chose to accept Harry as family through formal magical adoption." Amelia made careful notes, her mind racing through the implications. "Are you saying that Harry could have been safely placed with loving, magical families?" "Not only could have been, but should have been," Professor Babbling said firmly. "The magical adoption ritual would have created blood ward protections identical to those provided by birth relatives, with the added benefit of being powered by chosen love rather than biological obligation." The devastating revelation that followed came from an unexpected source. Percy Weasley entered the room carrying a leather portfolio that bore the official seal of the Department of International Magical Cooperation. His face was pale but determined as he approached the witness table, his usually pristine appearance slightly disheveled by what had clearly been an urgent and exhausting investigation. "Director Bones," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal, "I have been conducting a comprehensive review of Professor Dumbledore's official correspondence regarding the Potter case. What I have discovered fundamentally contradicts every justification he has offered for Harry's placement." Percy opened the portfolio and withdrew a series of letters, their aged parchment and familiar handwriting immediately recognizable to several people in the gallery. "These are copies of Professor Dumbledore's communications with Petunia Dursley, obtained through official channels from the International Confederation's archives." Amelia accepted the letters with hands that trembled slightly as she recognized their potential significance. The first letter, dated November 2nd, 1981, was written in Dumbledore's distinctive emerald ink and bore his official seal. "My dear Petunia," Amelia read aloud, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I trust you understand the magnitude of the responsibility you have accepted in caring for your nephew. The protection I have placed around him will endure as long as he can call your house his home. But I must stress that this protection requires more than mere physical shelter." She paused, her expression growing grimmer as she continued reading. "The child must remain isolated from the magical world to prevent hostile forces from locating him. Any contact with magical individuals, any display of kindness that might encourage him to consider himself wanted or valued, could compromise the delicate balance of the protective charms. He must believe himself to be unwanted, burdensome, and dependent entirely upon your grudging charity. Only through such careful emotional manipulation can we ensure that he never attempts to seek out the magical world before he is ready. The silence that followed was deafening. Harry's face had gone ashen, and Mrs. Weasley made a sound that was half sob, half growl of pure maternal fury. Throughout the gallery, Order members stared at each other with expressions of horror and dawning understanding. Percy continued reading from subsequent letters, each one more damning than the last. Dumbledore's correspondence revealed a systematic plan to ensure Harry's emotional isolation and dependence, couched in language that made cruelty sound like necessity and abuse seem like protection. "I understand your nephew's accidental magic has been particularly troublesome this summer," Percy read from a letter dated July 1987. "This is precisely the response we need to cultivate. His fear of his own abilities, combined with his desperate need for approval from the non-magical world, will ensure that he remains tractable when the time comes for him to fulfill his destiny. Continue your current methods. The results are precisely what we require." Griphook spoke into the shocked silence, his voice sharp with goblin directness. "Director Bones, these letters constitute clear evidence of a deliberate campaign to weaken the very protections that Professor Dumbledore claimed to be maintaining. Every instruction contained in this correspondence would have systematically degraded the Blood Ward structure." "How so?" "Blood Wards are powered by love, not fear. By deliberately cultivating Harry's sense of unworthiness and isolation, Professor Dumbledore was actively sabotaging the magical protections. A child who believes himself to be unwanted by his blood relatives cannot be protected by their love." Professor Babbling nodded gravely. "The magical theory is quite clear on this point. Protective charms rooted in familial sacrifice require the protected individual to feel genuine connection to their guardians. By ensuring that Harry felt rejected and unwanted, Professor Dumbledore was systematically destroying the very foundation of Lily Potter's sacrifice." The final devastating blow came from an unexpected quarter. Arthur Weasley entered the room carrying a manila folder that bore the official seal of the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office. His face was grim as he approached the witness table, and his hands shook slightly as he opened the folder. "Director Bones," he said quietly, "as part of my official duties, I maintain files on magical children living in predominantly Muggle environments. I was never informed that Harry Potter fell under this jurisdiction, but after reviewing the evidence presented in this investigation, I conducted my own inquiry into alternative placement options that were available in 1981. Arthur withdrew a thick sheaf of documents from the folder. "I have identified 17 magical families who formally applied to adopt Harry Potter in the months following his parents' deaths. These applications were submitted through proper ministry channels and included comprehensive background checks, financial assessments, and magical security evaluations." Amelia felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What happened to these applications?" "They were all rejected by Professor Dumbledore personally, using his authority as Harry's magical guardian. The rejection letters, copies of which I have obtained, state that alternative placement would compromise essential security arrangements, and that Harry's welfare required him to remain with his blood relatives." Arthur's voice grew thick with emotion as he continued. "Among the families who applied to adopt Harry were the Longbottoms, before their attack. The Bones family, 3 separate branches of the Potter family tree who survived Voldemort's initial persecution. All of them were rejected without explanation or consideration." The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a physical burden. Harry could have been raised by the Longbottoms, growing up as Neville's brother in a home filled with love and magical tradition. He could have been raised by Amelia Bones, growing up as Susan's brother in a family devoted to justice and protection. He could have been raised by any of dozens of loving, magical families who would have cherished him as their own. Instead, he had been deliberately placed with relatives who despised him, then systematically isolated from any support or affection that might have made his situation bearable. And all of it had been done in the name of protection that the abuse was actually undermining. "The evidence is overwhelming," Professor Babbling said quietly into the stunned silence. Professor Dumbledore did not place Harry Potter with the Dursleys to protect him. He placed Harry there to control him, to ensure his dependence and tractability, and to maintain psychological leverage over him for future use. The blood protection justification was a lie designed to prevent others from questioning his decisions. Griphook nodded grimly. "In the Goblin Nation, we have specific laws regarding the abuse of protective magic for purposes of control. What has been described here would be considered among the most serious magical crimes possible. The deliberate manipulation of a child's safety for personal or political gain." As the expert's testimony concluded, Amelia sat surrounded by evidence that transformed the investigation from a case of negligence to one of deliberate child endangerment and magical manipulation. The man who had been revered as the greatest wizard of his age had systematically tortured a child while claiming to protect him, had rejected loving families while claiming no alternatives existed, and had undermined the very magical protections he claimed to be maintaining. The scope of Dumbledore's deception was staggering in its completeness and chilling in its calculated cruelty. He had not merely failed Harry Potter, he had deliberately engineered his suffering for reasons that became more sinister with each piece of evidence. Harry sat in the witness gallery, surrounded by people who loved him, finally understanding the full magnitude of what had been stolen from him. Not just a childhood, not just safety and comfort, but the very possibility of growing up loved and wanted in a world where magic was a gift rather than a curse. The boy who had lived in cupboards and silence had finally learned the truth about why he had been placed there. And that truth would reshape everything. Chapter 10. Capture and Consequences. The arrest warrant bearing the seals of 17 magical governments arrived at the French Ministry of Magic just as dawn was breaking over the ancient streets of Paris. Captain Henri Dubois of the French Aura Corps read the document with the grim satisfaction of a man who had spent his career believing that justice should be blind to reputation and power. The evidence presented by the International Confederation had been overwhelming, and even France's initial reluctance to act against Albus Dumbledore had crumbled in the face of such systematic documentation of child abuse. "Assemble Team Alpha," Dubois instructed his lieutenant, his voice carrying the calm authority that had made him legendary among international law enforcement. "Full protective gear, maximum containment protocols. We're arresting the most powerful wizard alive, and we cannot afford to underestimate him." The safe house where Dumbledore had taken refuge stood in the heart of the Parisian magical district, its elegant facade hiding the complex protective wards that had been erected to shield him from extradition. But no amount of magical protection could withstand the combined authority of the international magical community when it acted in unison, and the warrant in Captain Dubois' hands carried powers that superseded any individual nation's sovereignty. The French auras moved with the precise choreography of elite magical law enforcement, their approach silent and coordinated, despite the magnitude of their target. When they breached the protective wards with the special dispensation charms provided by the International Confederation, the magical alarms that should have warned Dumbledore of their approach remained ominously silent. They found him in the study of the safe house, seated behind an ornate desk with his hands folded calmly before him. He wore the deep purple robes that had become his trademark, and his blue eyes held their familiar twinkle. But Captain Dubois' trained instincts detected something brittle beneath the surface composure. This was a man who had run out of places to hide and strategies to deploy. "Professor Albus Dumbledore," Captain Dubois said formally, his English heavily accented but precise. "You are under arrest by order of the International Confederation of Wizards for violations of the International Convention for the Protection of Magical Children. You will be extradited to Britain to face formal charges in connection with the systematic abuse and endangerment of Harry James Potter." Dumbledore nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting this moment. "I suppose flight was always a temporary solution," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual commanding presence. "I trust you will allow me to gather a few personal items before we depart?" "I'm afraid not, Professor," Captain Dubois replied firmly. "International fugitives are not permitted to collect belongings that might include escape devices or weapons. You will come with us immediately." The magical shackles that bound Dumbledore's wrists were inscribed with runes designed to prevent any form of magical resistance. As the French aurors escorted him from the safe house, photographers from international magical newspapers captured images that would appear on front pages across the globe. The most respected wizard of the age, walking between armed guards like a common criminal, his legendary power reduced to nothing by the simple application of law and evidence. The journey back to Britain was conducted under unprecedented security measures. The special magical transport vessel that carried Dumbledore across the English Channel was accompanied by auror escorts from 4 different nations, their presence ensuring that no rescue attempt or escape plan could succeed. International observers documented every aspect of the transfer, their reports becoming part of the historical record of the most significant arrest in modern magical history. Harry Potter stood at the window of Bones Manor, watching the dark clouds gather over the London skyline as news of Dumbledore's capture spread through the wizarding world. Susan sat beside him on the window seat, her presence a comfort that he was still learning to accept without guilt or suspicion. The complex mixture of emotions warring in his chest defied easy categorization. Relief that the man who had orchestrated his suffering could no longer evade justice, combined with a grief he couldn't quite explain for the loss of someone who had once represented safety and wisdom. "Are you all right?" Susan asked quietly, her voice cutting through the silence that had stretched between them for the better part of an hour. "I don't know," Harry admitted, his green eyes reflecting the storm clouds outside. "Part of me is glad that he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt me. But another part of me keeps remembering the way he looked when he rescued me from the Dursleys for the first time, like he genuinely cared about what happened to me." "Maybe he did care," Susan said thoughtfully. "Maybe that's what makes this so terrible, that someone who was capable of kindness chose cruelty instead. It would be easier if he had just been evil, wouldn't it?" The wisdom in her words hit Harry with unexpected force. He had spent years trying to reconcile the man who had given him chocolate frogs and twinkling eyes with the man who had deliberately engineered his abuse. The realization that both versions could be true, that Dumbledore's capacity for kindness made his choices even more inexcusable, was almost too complex to process. Meanwhile, across London, the emergency session of the Hogwarts Board of Governors convened with the kind of urgency usually reserved for wartime crises. The arrest of their headmaster had created a situation without precedent in the school's 1,000-year history, and the decisions made in the coming hours would determine whether Hogwarts could continue to function as an institution. "The school cannot open for the new term with this investigation ongoing," declared Griselda Marchbanks, her weathered face grave with the weight of responsibility. "The international scrutiny, the media attention, the questions about institutional complicity. We must have time to conduct our own internal review before we can guarantee the safety and well-being of the students in our care." Lucius Malfoy leaned back in his ornate chair, his expression one of barely concealed satisfaction. "I move that we suspend all operations at Hogwarts, pending a complete investigation into Professor Dumbledore's tenure as headmaster. The reputation of this institution has been irreparably damaged, and we owe it to the magical community to determine the full extent of his misconduct. The motion carried by a margin that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier, when Dumbledore's authority had seemed unassailable. The decision to close Hogwarts' pending investigation sent shockwaves through the magical community, forcing thousands of families to make emergency arrangements for their children's education, while the most prestigious magical school in Europe underwent the most thorough examination in its history. The media frenzy that surrounded Dumbledore's return to British soil was unlike anything the magical world had ever witnessed. Rita Skeeter's coverage for the Daily Prophet was relentless and sensational, but even the traditionally conservative magical newspapers found themselves competing to provide the most comprehensive analysis of the case. The Quibbler, despite its reputation for eccentricity, published a special edition that sold out within hours, its normally whimsical tone replaced by grave analysis of the institutional failures that had allowed such systematic abuse to continue unchecked. The most poignant coverage came from Witch Weekly, which published a series of interviews with magical families who had applied to adopt Harry Potter in 1981. The Longbottoms, speaking through Augusta before the attack that would devastate their family, had described their hope to provide Harry with a loving home where he could grow up alongside Neville as a brother. The Bones family had outlined their plans to raise Harry with the same love and protection they had provided for Susan after her parents' deaths. Each interview painted a picture of what Harry's life could have been, should have been, if Dumbledore had prioritized the child's well-being over his own mysterious agenda. The cumulative weight of these lost possibilities created a public outrage that transcended political divisions and united the magical community in a way that had not been seen since the darkest days of Voldemort's first reign. The preliminary hearing was scheduled to take place in the largest courtroom at the Ministry of Magic, but even that cavernous space could not accommodate the demand for public access. Magical law had always recognized the right of the public to observe legal proceedings, but the logistics of allowing hundreds of concerned citizens to witness the arraignment of Albus Dumbledore stretched the ministry's resources to their breaking point. When the day arrived, Courtroom 10 was packed beyond capacity, with representatives from every segment of magical society. International observers occupied the front rows, their presence underscoring the global significance of the proceedings. Behind them sat Wizengamot members, ministry officials, members of the press, and ordinary witches and wizards who had taken time off work to witness this moment in magical history. Harry entered the courtroom accompanied by Amelia Bones and surrounded by protective auras, his young face pale but determined as he prepared to confront the man who had shaped his life through such calculated cruelty. He had debated whether to attend the hearing, torn between his need to see justice done and his reluctance to face Dumbledore in person. In the end, Susan's quiet support and his own growing understanding of his right to see his abuser held accountable had convinced him to take his place in the witness gallery. When Dumbledore was led into the courtroom in magical restraints, the silence was absolute. The man who had commanded such respect and authority appeared diminished by his circumstances, his usual commanding presence reduced to something almost fragile. His blue eyes found Harry's across the crowded courtroom, and for a moment, something that might have been genuine regret flickered across his features. The charges were read with the formal precision required by magical law, each count carrying the weight of years of documented abuse and manipulation. Systematic child endangerment, deliberate negligence in the performance of guardianship duties, conspiracy to prevent official oversight of a magical minor, abuse of authority in the obstruction of lawful adoption proceedings, false imprisonment through magical coercion. Each charge was supported by evidence that had been gathered through weeks of meticulous investigation, testimony that had been given under veritaserum, and documentation that could not be disputed or explained away. The case against Dumbledore was as comprehensive as it was damning, built with the kind of methodical precision that left no room for reasonable doubt. When asked how he pleaded to the charges, Dumbledore's voice was barely audible in the packed courtroom. "I acted in what I believe to be the best interests of both Harry Potter and the wizarding world," he said quietly. "My methods may have been imperfect, but they were born of necessity and guided by knowledge that others did not possess. It was not a plea of guilty or innocent, but rather an attempt to justify actions that the evidence had already proven to be unjustifiable." The preliminary hearing concluded with Dumbledore remanded to Azkaban pending trial, his bail denied due to his status as an international flight risk and the severity of the charges against him. As Harry watched the man who had once been the most powerful wizard in the world led away in chains, he felt something shift inside his chest. The fear and confusion that had dominated his relationship with authority figures for 15 years began to give way to something else, the understanding that power without accountability was not strength but weakness, and that justice, however long delayed, could still be achieved. The boy who had lived in cupboards and silence had finally seen his abuser face the consequences of his actions. It was not the end of Harry's journey toward healing, but it was a beginning that he had never dared to imagine possible. Chapter 11. The Trial of Albus Dumbledore. The ancient chambers of the full Wizengamot had not hosted a trial of such magnitude in living memory. Every seat in the horseshoe-shaped assembly was occupied, the purple-robed figures of magical Britain's highest judicial body, creating an imposing backdrop for what historians would later call the most significant legal proceeding of the modern magical era. The weight of centuries pressed down upon the proceedings, as though the very stones of the ministry bore witness to this moment when justice would finally be served. Albus Dumbledore sat in the defendant's chair at the center of the chamber, his hands bound with the same magical restraints that had contained him since his arrest. The man who had once commanded this very assembly as chief warlock appeared diminished by his circumstances, his usually commanding presence reduced to something almost frail. Yet his blue eyes still held their familiar intelligence, and those who knew him well could see that he was preparing to make one final attempt to justify the unjustifiable. Chief Warlock Amelia Bones presided over the proceedings with the kind of stern authority that had made her legendary throughout the international magical community. Her promotion to the position had been unanimous, born of respect for her integrity and her courage in pursuing this investigation despite tremendous political pressure. She called the session to order with a gravity befitting the historic nature of what was about to unfold. "We are assembled today," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the packed chamber, "to hear evidence in the matter of Regina versus Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, on charges of systematic child endangerment, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and abuse of magical authority. The defendant stands accused of deliberately facilitating the abuse of Harry James Potter over a period of 15 years, while preventing others from providing aid or intervention. The prosecution was led by senior prosecutor Kingsley Shacklebolt, whose credentials in both magical law enforcement and his own experience as an order member lent additional weight to his presentation. He rose to address the Wizengamot with the measured authority of someone who understood that he was not merely seeking justice for one child, but accountability for an entire system that had failed in its most fundamental duty. "Honorable members of the Wizengamot," Kingsley began, his deep voice resonating through the chamber. "The evidence we will present today tells the story of a child who was systematically tortured in the name of protection, isolated in the name of safety, and manipulated in the name of the greater good. But more than that, it tells the story of how one man's unchecked authority allowed him to commit atrocities while convincing others that they were necessary sacrifices. The presentation of evidence was methodical and devastating. Each piece of testimony that had been gathered over the course of the investigation was presented with clinical precision, building an overwhelming case that left no room for reasonable doubt. The magical transcripts of Harry's own words hung in the air before the assembly, his matter-of-fact recitation of abuse made even more powerful by the formal setting of the trial. Professor McGonagall's testimony was read aloud, her words carrying the weight of institutional credibility as she described her objections to Harry's placement and the way those objections had been dismissed. Hagrid's emotional account of being forbidden to check on the child he had delivered to the Dursleys brought tears to the eyes of several Wizengamot members. The systematic pattern of isolation and manipulation emerged with inexorable clarity as witness after witness described how they had been prevented from helping Harry. But it was the expert testimony that proved most damaging to any possible defense. Professor Babbling's explanation of blood ward requirements was presented with scientific precision, leaving no doubt that Harry's abuse had actively undermined the very protections it was supposed to maintain. The revelation that 17 loving families had applied to adopt Harry, only to be rejected by Dumbledore personally, created a wave of audible shock that rippled through the assembly. When Kingsley read Dumbledore's own letters to Petunia Dursley, outlining his deliberate plan to ensure Harry's emotional isolation and dependence, the chamber fell into absolute silence. The words hung in the air like an indictment of everything the magical world claimed to stand for. Proof that their greatest hero had systematically tortured a child while claiming to protect him. The evidence is overwhelming, Kingsley concluded after hours of methodical presentation. The defendant did not merely fail in his duty to protect Harry Potter. He deliberately engineered the child's suffering for his own purposes, then manipulated others into accepting that suffering is necessary. This was not negligence. This was not a well-meaning mistake. This was calculated abuse of power in service of an ideology that placed abstract concepts above the welfare of individual children. Dumbledore's defense attorney, a nervous-looking wizard who had clearly struggled with taking on such an unpopular case, rose to present what amounted to the only possible defense left: that Dumbledore's actions, however harsh they might seem, had been necessary to prevent greater evil. "Honourable members of the Wizengamot," the attorney said, his voice lacking conviction, "we do not dispute that Professor Dumbledore's methods were unconventional. But we must consider the context in which these decisions were made. Voldemort was the greatest threat our world had ever faced, and desperate times required desperate measures. Professor Dumbledore possessed knowledge about the prophecy connecting Harry Potter and Voldemort that others didn't have, knowledge that informed every decision he made. It was at this moment that Dumbledore himself requested permission to address the Wizengamot directly. Rising from the defendant's chair with whatever dignity he could muster, he faced the assembly that had once hung on his every word. When he spoke, his voice carried echoes of his former authority, but the words themselves revealed the fundamental corruption at the heart of his philosophy. "I do not ask for forgiveness," he said, his blue eyes sweeping across the assembled judges. "I ask for understanding. Every decision I made was guided by knowledge of a prophecy that demanded Harry Potter grow up apart from our world, that he develop the strength born of adversity, that he learn to value life through experiencing its hardships. The greater good sometimes requires individual sacrifice, and I bore the burden of ensuring that Harry would be prepared for the destiny that awaited him." "You speak of destiny and prophecy," Chief Warlock Bones interrupted, her voice cutting through his practiced rhetoric. "But the evidence shows that your decisions actively endangered the child you claim to have been protecting. How do you reconcile your stated goals with the documented weakening of the very magical protections you said required his suffering? For the first time since the trial began, Dumbledore's composure cracked. The careful facade he had maintained throughout the proceedings slipped, revealing something desperate and defensive beneath. The magical protections were secondary to the psychological conditioning that was required, he said, his voice rising slightly. Harry needed to understand sacrifice, needed to value others' lives above his own, needed to be willing to die for the greater good when the time came. Comfort and kindness would have made him weak, selfish, unprepared for what was required of him. The admission sent a shock through the assembly. Here was the truth behind all the careful justifications and noble rhetoric. Dumbledore had deliberately tortured Harry Potter, not to protect him, but to psychologically condition him for sacrifice. The greater good he spoke of required not just Harry's eventual death, but his willingness to embrace that death, and every moment of abuse had been calculated to achieve that end. It was then that Harry Potter himself rose from the witness gallery and asked permission to address the defendant directly. The request was unprecedented, but Chief Warlock Bones recognized the symbolic importance of allowing the victim to confront his abuser. Harry walked to the center of the chamber with steady steps, his young face pale but determined as he faced the man who had shaped his life through such calculated cruelty. "You say you prepared me for sacrifice," Harry said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. "You say that my suffering made me strong, made me willing to die for others. But you're wrong about what my suffering taught me." Dumbledore looked up at him with an expression that might have been genuine curiosity, as though he truly wanted to understand what his grand experiment had produced. "My suffering taught me that children should be protected, not used," Harry continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "It taught me that kindness matters more than destiny, that love is more powerful than manipulation, that people who claim to act for the greater good while hurting the innocent are just cowards hiding behind noble words." The young man who stood before the Wizengamot bore little resemblance to the broken child who had lived in cupboards and silence. The strength he displayed came not from the abuse he had endured, but from the love and support he had finally been allowed to experience. His courage to face Dumbledore directly, to speak truth to the power that had once seemed unassailable, represented everything the old man's philosophy had failed to understand. "You didn't prepare me for sacrifice," Harry said quietly. "You prepared me to recognize the difference between necessary sacrifice and needless cruelty. And what you did to me was needless cruelty, dressed up in pretty words about destiny and the greater good." The silence that followed Harry's words was profound and lasting. When Chief Warlock Bones finally called for the Wizengamot's verdict, the vote was unanimous. Guilty on all counts: the systematic abuse and endangerment of a magical child, the conspiracy to obstruct justice and prevent lawful intervention, the abuse of magical authority for personal and political purposes. The sentencing was swift and final. Dumbledore's magical abilities were bound by ancient ritual, his wand snapped and his power stripped from him for the remainder of his natural life. He was sentenced to Azkaban prison for a term of 25 years, with no possibility of early release. The additional punishment of magical binding ensured that he would spend his remaining years as the Muggles lived, powerless and ordinary, dependent on the mercy of others for his survival. As the Dementors led Dumbledore from the chamber, his magical restraints replaced by the soul-draining presence of Azkaban's guards, he looked back once at Harry Potter. What passed between them in that final moment was impossible to read. Perhaps regret, perhaps a last desperate attempt at justification, perhaps simply the bewilderment of a man who had never understood that the children he sacrificed for the greater good were individual human beings worthy of love and protection. Harry watched him go with emotions too complex for easy categorization. There was relief, certainly, that the man who had orchestrated his suffering could never hurt another child. There was satisfaction in seeing justice finally served after 15 years of systematic abuse. But there was also something like sadness for the loss of the man he had once believed Dumbledore to be, the wise protector who had existed only in Harry's desperate need to believe that someone, somewhere, had cared about what happened to him. As the Wizengamot chamber emptied and the historic trial concluded, Harry Potter stood surrounded by people who had chosen to fight for him without expecting anything in return. The boy who had lived in cupboards and silence had finally seen his abuser face the full consequences of his actions. Justice, however long delayed, had finally been served. The trial of Albus Dumbledore was over. The healing of Harry Potter could finally begin. Chapter 12. New Beginnings. The kitchen at Grimmauld Place had been transformed in ways that went far beyond the obvious physical improvements. Where once the ancient walls had held the bitter darkness of the Black family's legacy, warm light now streamed through windows that had been cleaned and opened for the first time in decades. The oppressive silence that had defined the house for so long had been replaced by the comfortable sounds of a home where people lived and laughed and belonged. Harry Potter sat at the scrubbed wooden table, watching Sirius attempt to make breakfast with the kind of determined enthusiasm that spoke of someone learning to care for others after years of being able to care only for himself. The pancakes were slightly lopsided, and the eggs were rather more scrambled than intended, but the love behind the effort was unmistakable, and that made them perfect in ways that had nothing to do with culinary expertise. "You know," Sirius said, sliding a plate in front of Harry with the casual affection that was still new enough to make Harry's chest tight with gratitude, "I never thought I'd be the type to fuss over proper nutrition, but Mrs. Weasley has been very specific about making sure you eat regularly. Apparently, 15 years of irregular meals requires some dedicated catching up." Harry smiled, a genuine expression that came more easily now than it had just weeks ago. "She's been sending care packages to Amelia's house, too. I think she's trying to feed half the magical world through sheer force of will." The mention of recent events brought a comfortable silence to the kitchen, the kind that came between people who had shared something profound and life-changing. The trial had concluded just 3 days ago, but the reverberations were still spreading through every corner of magical society, creating changes that would reshape their world for generations to come. The transformation had begun almost immediately. The International Confederation of Wizards had moved with unprecedented speed to implement new oversight protocols for magical child welfare, establishing review boards in every magical nation, and creating binding treaties that would prevent future systematic abuse. The reforms bore Amelia Bones's influence in their comprehensive scope and their emphasis on accountability over reputation. Amelia herself had been awarded the Order of Merlin, First Class, for her courage in pursuing justice despite enormous political pressure. The ceremony had been held the previous day in the renovated Wizengamot chambers, attended by representatives from 17 magical nations who had come to honor not just her individual bravery, but the principle that no one, regardless of their power or past service, could be permitted to operate above the law. Harry had watched from the gallery as she accepted the honor with characteristic grace. Her brief speech focused not on her own actions, but on the importance of listening to those who had no voice and protecting those who could not protect themselves. It was exactly the kind of response he had come to expect from the woman who had chosen to believe his story, when believing it meant challenging everything magical Britain claimed to stand for. "She deserves it," Harry said quietly, cutting into his pancakes. "I don't know what would have happened if she hadn't decided to ask the right questions." Sirius nodded, his expression growing serious despite the domestic warmth of the moment. "She saved you, Harry, not just from the Dursleys, but from a system that would have continued to sacrifice your well-being for political convenience. That kind of courage should be recognized." The recognition had extended beyond official honors. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for the reforms being implemented, and donations to magical child welfare organizations had increased dramatically as ordinary witches and wizards grappled with the realization that their greatest hero had been a systematic abuser. The magical world was confronting some uncomfortable truths about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of questioning even the most revered figures. Hogwarts had reopened under McGonagall's leadership just days after the trial concluded, the new headmistress moving quickly to address the institutional failures that had allowed Dumbledore's abuses to continue unchecked. The first change had been the establishment of an independent student advocacy office, staffed by professionals trained to identify signs of abuse and empowered to investigate concerns without regard for political considerations. The second change had been more symbolic but equally important: the removal of Dumbledore's portrait from the headmaster's office, along with all traces of his influence over school policy. The decision had been controversial among some older alumni, but McGonagall had been firm in her conviction that true healing required acknowledging the full scope of what had been done in the name of education and protection. "Professor McGonagall sent an owl yesterday," Harry mentioned, reaching for the marmalade. "She wanted to make sure I knew that if I ever wanted to talk about what happened at Hogwarts during Dumbledore's tenure, she would listen. She said the school needed to understand how its failures had affected me, so they could make sure it never happened to anyone else. Will you talk to her?" Harry considered the question seriously. The idea of revisiting his school years with the knowledge he now possessed was daunting, but he was beginning to understand that his healing was connected to helping prevent others from experiencing what he had endured. "I think so. Not right away, but eventually. Maybe when I'm ready to go back." The question of returning to Hogwarts had been complicated by everything that had happened. Harry was technically supposed to begin his 6th year in just a few weeks, but the idea of walking those familiar corridors knowing what he now knew about their former headmaster felt overwhelming. McGonagall had assured him that his place would be held for as long as he needed, whether that meant starting late or taking a full year to focus on healing. The Order of the Phoenix had undergone its own transformation in the aftermath of the trial. What had begun as shock and guilt over their unwitting complicity in Harry's abuse had evolved into a determined effort to support his healing and ensure that their organization could never again be manipulated into enabling harm. Remus Lupin had become a regular visitor to Grimmauld Place, his own guilt over years of enforced separation from Harry driving him to offer whatever support and guidance he could provide. The werewolf's gentle presence and stories about James and Lily had become an important part of Harry's journey toward understanding his own history, beyond the trauma that had defined it for so long. Mrs. Weasley had appointed herself as something between a mother figure and a protective force of nature, appearing regularly with home-cooked meals and fierce hugs that spoke of love offered without conditions or expectations. Her presence in Harry's life represented everything Dumbledore's philosophy had failed to understand: that children needed unconditional care, not conditional protection based on their usefulness to adult agendas. Even Snape had made an awkward but genuine attempt at reconciliation, his own guilt over years of treating Harry with hostility, despite recognizing signs of abuse, driving him to offer a stiff but sincere apology. The conversation had been uncomfortable for both of them, but it had marked an important step in Harry's understanding that even imperfect people could choose to do better when confronted with the truth. But perhaps the most significant relationship in Harry's healing had been his growing friendship with Susan Bones, whose steady presence and understanding had become a cornerstone of his new life. She arrived at Grimmauld Place that afternoon, carrying a picnic basket, and wearing the kind of determined expression that Harry had learned meant she had plans for his well-being, whether he was aware of them or not. "We're going to the park," she announced, setting the basket on the kitchen table with authority. "It's a beautiful day. You've been cooped up in this house for 3 days straight, and I've brought sandwiches that don't involve Sirius's creative interpretation of cooking instructions." Sirius laughed, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "I'll have you know my cooking is improving. Harry hasn't complained once about the experimental flavor combinations." "That's because Harry is too polite to complain," Susan replied with the kind of fond exasperation that spoke of genuine friendship. "But politeness doesn't require him to subsist entirely on your culinary experiments." The easy banter between them highlighted something that Harry was still learning to navigate: the simple pleasure of being cared for by people who expected nothing in return. The concept of unconditional friendship had been so foreign to his experience that he sometimes found himself waiting for the conditions to be revealed, for the moment when his friends would explain what he owed them for their kindness. But Susan's friendship came without price or expectation, offered simply because she had chosen to care about his well-being. Their shared experience of growing up in the shadow of their family's involvement in the war against Voldemort had created a bond that went beyond typical teenage friendship, built on understanding rather than hero worship or pity. They spent the afternoon in the small park near Grimmauld Place, sitting on a bench under an old oak tree while Susan unpacked sandwiches, and Harry tried to process the strange sensation of feeling genuinely safe in a public space. The warmth of the late August sun on his face, the comfortable silence between friends, the simple pleasure of food shared without calculation or fear. These were experiences so fundamentally different from his childhood that he sometimes felt like he was learning to live in an entirely new world. "Do you think about him?" Susan asked quietly, her question breaking through his contemplation. "Dumbledore, I mean. Do you wonder what he's thinking about all of this?" Harry considered the question seriously. In the 3 days since the trial, he had found himself thinking about the man who had shaped his life through such calculated cruelty less than he had expected. The obsessive need to understand Dumbledore's motivations that had driven him for weeks seemed to have faded now that justice had been served and the truth had been acknowledged. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but not in the way I used to. I used to wonder what I had done wrong, what I could have done differently to earn his protection instead of his manipulation. Now I just feel sorry for him, I guess. Sorry that someone who could have chosen to love and protect children chose to use them instead." Susan nodded, her understanding evident in the way she didn't try to analyze his response or suggest what he should feel. That acceptance, the simple acknowledgement that his emotions were valid regardless of their complexity, had become one of the most healing aspects of his new relationships. As the sun began to set and they prepared to return to Grimmauld Place, Harry felt something he had never experienced before: the deep, bone-level certainty that he was safe, that he was wanted, that he belonged somewhere in the world. It wasn't the desperate gratitude that had characterized his relationships during his Hogwarts years, when every kindness felt like a gift that could be withdrawn at any moment. It was simply the quiet confidence that came from being loved without conditions. That evening, as Sirius helped him organize the bedroom that was truly his own for the first time in his life, Harry found himself reflecting on everything that had changed since Amelia Bones had first decided to ask uncomfortable questions about his childhood. The investigation that had begun with a thin file and a prosecutor's instincts had transformed not just his own life, but the entire structure of magical society. "Sirius," he said, sitting on the bed that was his own, in the room that was his own, in the house where he was wanted and protected. "Do you think things will really be different now? For other children, I mean." Sirius sat down beside him, his expression serious despite the warmth in his eyes. "I think," he said carefully, "that people who might have ignored signs of abuse before will find it much harder to look the other way now. I think children who need help will be more likely to get it. And I think that's because one person was brave enough to tell the truth about what happened to her, even when that truth was difficult to hear." "Amelia Bones, you mean?" "Her too," Sirius said with a smile. "But I was thinking of someone else. Someone who had the courage to trust that the truth was worth telling, even after 15 years of being taught that his pain didn't matter. Someone who refused to let his abuser hide behind noble words and political protection." The realization that Sirius was talking about him, about his own role in bringing about this change, settled over Harry with quiet wonder. For so long, he had thought of himself as something that happened to other people, a burden to be managed, a weapon to be shaped, a symbol to be manipulated. The idea that he had been an active agent in creating change, that his decision to trust Amelia Bones and tell his story had reshaped their entire world, was almost too large to process. But as he lay in bed that night, surrounded by the sounds of a home where he was wanted and protected, Harry Potter finally understood what the adults in his life had been trying to tell him for weeks. He was not just someone who had survived terrible things. He was someone who had used his survival to protect others. Someone whose courage to speak truth to power had created a world where children would be safer than they had been before. The boy who had lived in cupboards and silence had finally found his voice, and in finding it, he had discovered that sometimes the most powerful magic of all was the simple act of refusing to let injustice